Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Turnip's Digest. Starting right on time, 8 o'clock a.m., the Protestant work ethic still shines through today. And in fact, I am joined by a fellow Protestant, Jay Burden, this morning. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on, Ryan.
I'm very happy to have you here. I was on your channel earlier this week. That was a absolutely wonderful stream. We went back to the topic that started my channel, specifically the Zoomers. Talked about them for a long time, and in all likelihood, we are probably going to talk about them here again. But that's just my appearance. Where can people find you? What do you do? Who are you?
So, I am a host of the Jay Burden Show, which is a 2 to 3 times weekly interview show. And if it's an account under about 10,000 subscribers on YouTube and you watch them, I've probably had them on my show. I've had a lot of appearances from, Thomas 777. I've also had, Semiagog, kind of people in those spheres. Normally it's about an hour, and that show is available on YouTube under the Jay Burden Show. It is also available on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen to audio-only podcasts, just a few hours afterwards. And so that's where you can find my show. And if you want more links, like my socials, I think Ryan has added those to the description of the video.
Yes, in fact, you have a Find My Friends, which is our good friend Charlemagne, making sure that our sphere, the dissident right, as it's called, does not just suddenly disappear into the aether. So you can find Jay Burden on there. In fact, I think I updated the description to this stream so that you can actually get the link to his Find My Friends. That is all of his stuff there. Anything else, Mr. Burden?
No, and I'm very grateful for the Find My Friends. I know that Charlie does that entirely by himself, and he's a busy guy. So I really do appreciate it because, as I was saying before we went live, as much as I don't like Linktree likes me even less. So it's probably good to get off of there.
Yeah, it's something that our friends own. So we're why would we use anything else? So that's a good thing. Always happy to advertise the fact that we are using Find My Friends and nothing else. So with all that being said, on your channel this last week, we discussed. You originally just said you want to discuss the Zoomers, and then that, just because of the nature of me and abstraction and all of that, turned into a broader topic. We touched just a little bit on cultural dissolution to summarize the discussion. Standards have collapsed, institutions have collapsed. Anything else that would sound like things are going wrong is happening. Any incentives to do good are not there anymore or have been inverted. But that at your stream, that was just tangential to the topic. That was kind of like explaining what was going on. So we kind of steered clear from some of that. But now you're on my channel. Inspired me to get you on here. We're here to talk about some of the more foundational issues, plus whatever you would like to talk about. So why don't you, just in case people didn't catch the stream over at your channel, give us some sort of background about, how were you raised? How would you be related to this topic at all? A little bit more about who are you without doxing yourself.
Oh, of course. So I have kind of a non-standard path growing up. Without getting too into it, my mother was significantly mentally ill. And so essentially that means that I was raised largely, especially early in life, by my grandparents. And so my grandparents are prime baby boomers. They were essentially kind of godless hippies until they had a midlife conversion, and then kind of after their midlife conversion went through kind of like the baby boomer steps, right? Went to Vietnam, started a small business, did well for themselves. And so I was raised by those people, and they went to an extremely conservative Baptist church. And so while I'm not myself Baptist, I have a great deal of association with kind of that Southern low church tradition. I was homeschooled up until elementary school, or through elementary school. And then I went to, as I was discussing on Twitter a few days ago, a classical Christian school, which is a move in kind of the Christian community, started in kind of the early 90s to essentially return to the Christian scholastic tradition. So I was taught Greek, the great books, lots of memory work, lots of recitation. And in that, I kind of devoted or found myself a pretty close group of friends and mentors. So George Bagby, who's been on my channel, he was one of my teachers there. We've become, lifelong friends. And so that's how I became interested in these sort of things. Now I live in a small town in Central Virginia, with a small, close-knit religious community. I am a member of a fairly conservative Presbyterian church. I am not necessarily the person to get into theological disputes on, just because I kind of take the Kierkegaard tack towards theology, which is Lamau plus don't care, which is obviously I'm simplifying it, but I just mean to say that I'm not
yeah, you can simplify it even better and just say have faith, lol.
Yeah, exactly, right. Which, and not to get it off on that topic, just to say like, hey, if you want to talk to someone about theology, I'm probably not your guy. But I guess I really kind of came to these circles because when I, like a lot of people, I saw kind of a widespread cultural dissolution, and specifically in my family, despite the fact that I was raised as a family that went to church, I'm now the only person who does, the only person who kind of cares for things that are higher. And I still love my family, but it was kind of this feeling like, wait a minute, like just going along to get along isn't good enough. And so a big part of that was, and not to just show my own stream again, but a while back, Saddam and Ace and I went back through one of my college professors. And when I graduated high school, I decided to go to a prestigious small liberal arts college, basically because it was the best school that I got into, and I wanted to go to a good school. And it was a really dark place, not just in like, oh, it's my freshman year, I'm lonely, no one will hang out with me kind of way. But it was extremely culturally dark. So this school had at one time, and this is pretty common among American institutes of higher education, had been a seminary. And so there were these old relics of Christianity around, not literal relics, but you understand what I mean. And they had been kind of chiseled away and replaced with kind of symbols of, like the secular modern religion. And so this is also the same institution where I met my Gamergate professor. This is the one that we did a stream on a while back, the literal clown who was teaching me. And I essentially dropped out of school. I was super disillusioned. I just felt very kind of like hopeless and disconnected. And so from there, I kind of restarted my ideological journey. I think like a lot of people in my age, I kind of fell into the Peterson cul-de-sac for a while and kind of slowly moved rightward because, obviously being a student of Bagby, right, I had these kind of like very deep right-wing, I guess, convictions on kind of like a pre-rational level. But I was kind of stuck in that, oh, I have to be kind of respectable. I have to, I can't go too far. So I'm just going to be kind of a hand-wavy libertarian, like, oh, well, the cultural stuff doesn't matter. We'll just let people choose. And then really over the next few years of reading, as I went back to school and especially COVID, I kind of realized like, wait a minute, this isn't working anymore. Like we need to do something significantly different. And a big part of that was, through COVID and the summer of love, the idea that the kind of cultural rot and the cultural disillusion is easily repairable. That lie was shown to be a falsehood very cleanly in my mind. And
right.
So to me,
I remember, sorry, you'll keep going here in a second. I remember before then, there were a lot of people just saying, we just need to fix X. And then everything would sort itself out again. It would all go back to normal. And I haven't really heard that as much since 2020. Right.
And so obviously like everyone's radicalization is a slow process. Like I was stuck at the time, kind of pre-COVID, in this part where I'd been reading Moldbug for a while. Not to say like Moldbug is like the epitome of right-wing thought, but he's a pretty out and out reactionary. And so I kind of had the Moldbug side of my brain and the I guess like the classical liberal side were stuck in a wrestling match, and I just couldn't square that circle. And then a combination of right when actually R.N. McIntyre showed up on the scene, that was kind of when it clicked for me, so to speak. And then over COVID, and I'm sure you remember, I guess less so because you're thankfully in Oklahoma, but in the state that I am in, it was a significant possibility that based off of one political election, essentially, like I wouldn't I would be kicked out of school. I would
Yeah,
not be
yeah,
able
that
to get a
happened
job.
here.
And
Like,
so basically there was this point where I sat down and I was like, oh, like if I'm going to do something I believe is right, like this is a moral thing for me, I'm gonna have to I might have to suffer for it. Like I might actually have to take a hit here. And so to me, that both was kind of a wake up call in the sense like, wait a minute, like I'm kind of part of the vanguard, so to speak, not in some like, LARPy Leninist sense, but like, wait, like if we're going to do this, we're going to have to actually be serious about it. And on the other end, this kind of realization that like the vast majority of people are not doing well at all. Like they are very much kind of subverted and distorted. And the amount of people, and this is actually the last time I was on normie social media was 2020, because I saw people, many of whom I still care for deeply, get so just damaged by lockdowns, by COVID. And that doesn't mean to say that everything was fine in 2019, but you saw people degrade and change so much over a short period of time. And you're like, wait a minute, there's something deeply, deeply wrong. And so to tie it back into kind of the cultural disillusion, at least how I took it was, first you start at the very tip. You're like, oh, well, people have ideas that aren't good. Let's win an argument. And then you start to realize like, wait a minute, having the right argument doesn't mean you win the day. And then you step back and you're like, wait a minute, not only does convincing them not work, you can't really convince people. And so you kind of start to go further up and further up the stream, so to speak, and you realize like, wait a minute, this isn't just a problem of we need to, return to 1993 or 1953. Like there's something sincerely wrong in this. And a big part of that is, kind of the topic of the stream, which is this kind of like social disillusion. And it's something that is easy to quantify in education because there are metrics associated with it, right? That we can see that the quality of education has manifestly declined. Look, I'm the first one to admit, I was an A student through high school, through my 2-year degree. And then once I got to my, the place where I eventually graduated from, COVID happened and everyone, myself included, stopped caring because it was fake school, right? You didn't have to do anything. You could still pass. And so to be honest, and this is why I don't have my face associated with this, my degree is a sham. Like I really don't know what I'm doing because no one did. And there was the game theory on it, right? Like if the standards are low, there's neither a carrot nor a stick. Why would you care? And I realize that's a moral failing on my part. But a big part of that is essentially like the institutions of, to a certain degree, of shame and social connection, and also just like pure disciplinary power have all gone out the wayside.
right. If you were going to pursue a degree or something like this seriously, you would expect the education to be serious. Like even if you were there to learn, if it suddenly became a sham or a joke, you wouldn't do anything because now that basic incentive is gone. Even if you were moral and productive.
Right, and I'm the first one to admit like that was not the morally correct thing to do. Like I admit that on my part. So, but at the same time, that trend of people, there is nothing expected of you, so people will produce nothing, I think is a widespread trend. And what I think we also saw, and this has been neatly, I guess, exemplified in modern society, but you can also see it in education, is Sam Francis's concept of anarcho-tyranny, right? So essentially, the untermensch, the underclasses of society, the central power is no longer really able to control them. So obviously, this is the BLM coalition in the wider U.S. This is the New Britons, if you follow my tact, in the UK. They really can't control them, for a variety of reasons. So they just let them run amok, and they specifically direct them towards kind of like the middle, the people who actually produce the things that drive a society forward. And they use them almost as an unofficial enforcement arm, right? So Sam Francis's essay, Anarcho-Tyranny, is quite short. I recommend anyone read it. And if you can't read for some reason, Skeptical Waves, I think, has done a narration of it.
Yes.
But my point is, you see that same mechanism everywhere. And so look, like I was lucky I didn't go to a public high school. I was in a rural enough area that my public high school, it wouldn't have been violent. It just was not a very good school. And so my parents, thankfully, put the money in and sent me private school. But when you see the videos of more diverse school systems, with a lot of violence in it. When you read things like, recently PQ has been going into, a series on, education specifically in, the big New York schools, you realize like this pattern has existed for a long time. And really, like, if you look at the start of it, I think at least that kind of it really speaks to kind of a dissolution of social bonds, right? That kind of divorce of all from all, that Carlyle talks about.
Right. That is a perfect introduction there. Just because out of that, I have written down things because this is all very good and I don't want to forget it. I've got about 10 points here that we can visit throughout the stream, depending on how long we dwell on them. Before we do that, though, there's just a couple of things that I saw in the chat that I would like to address. We have the Zesty Car saying, Turnip, where did you stream on Kenya with Panama Hat go? I didn't get a chance to listen to it. In the new YouTube update, things are a bit strange. It is going to be under the live category because it was live streamed. It is still there for all 4.5 hours of it. 13 days ago is what it says on mine, or it'll be at the bottom of home, but that will be gone as time goes on. So, that is a formatting issue. I
know this is not like a particularly new discussion, but
yeah.
I absolutely despise the mentality of big tech companies, and it's specifically I know better than you. Like, we were even talking about this before I go live. I was not late to the broadcast, but late to kind of appearing because Microsoft did a force update and it ruined my computer. So I had to go through and uncheck all the boxes they did. And it's
but you needed that update because it's more efficient.
Yes, it is. And look, I'm no programmer, I'm no coder. I don't really understand how computers work. You could tell me they work by like electronomes and I could not prove you wrong. But that said, I'm smart enough to know how to configure something, so please just leave me alone. And you see that with the new YouTube update, which is a catastrophically bad update. And this is, if you follow down, this happens, this story arc plays out roughly every 2 years, and it's never changed. Like the fact that we still have the stupid TikTok shorts on YouTube that no one watches except by accident.
Yeah. And I can't remember a time where YouTube or Microsoft has updated themselves and people have gone, oh yeah, I really like this update. Very pleasant. Every single time there's just wide outcry saying, I absolutely hate this. I had just learned the old one. Everything was working fine. I had just gotten used to it. And they just come and like move buttons around and make things slightly different. And now I have to relearn the whole thing.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So I figured I would address that just because they, if I'm going to be live streaming or anything along those lines, it's very difficult to put the time into making a video on top of everything else that I'm doing in school. This is much less intensive, believe it or not. They have kind of just thrown everything under a live category. As I said, you can still see some of it at the bottom of home under my page, but that will be gone in a few more videos. So don't let that trick you. They will they'll hide good content from you. And then, of course, just because it's the stream, a bit early for a stream, my friend, our good friend there, Mr. Carlson. Yes, that is the Protestant side of this stream shining through. I can even get Panama Hat, our favorite Roman Catholic, to show up at the Protestant hour of 8 o'clock a.m. Central Time. So with all of that being said, though, this wonderful list of topics that you brought up in that opening, I guess we will. I guess we'll just start with something very basic. You said you noticed something was wrong with the majority, like things just were not working. There was something offsetting, and you realized this either explicitly or implicitly. Could you do you remember when you realized that, when you had that idea?
So yeah, I think that there's, and this is a theological concept that we don't need to get into, but I'll use to kind of explore this, that there is kind of like a baseline level of human corruption, right? Obviously societies are better or worse, but look, in any society, maybe at a lesser rate, I assume that whatever the Puritan version of robbing a liquor store was, at least someone did it. Like there's kind of a baseline level of human corruption. And so look, I get that. But specifically when you see things like, you go to you go to church, and you go to a relatively conservative church and you look around and you're like, wait a minute, like, why are half the people here getting divorced? Why are, the vast majority of young people leaving and never coming back? Why are people essentially like overweight and miserable? And look, like there is just a baseline amount of human misery. I get that, and I'm not saying people have to have perfect lives. And I think also there is this feeling, because I very much kind of came to awareness and came into my own, during the Obama years, where it was kind of this like this widespread feeling like, wait a minute, like our government isn't run for us anymore. And look, like I get it that there's this kind of Cassandra-like tendency to always say like, oh, things are getting worse, things are getting worse. But I mean, especially in kind of like the rural South, like things did get materially way worse from the 90s, right? CJ, that's just well said. But when you see things like, look, like the big furniture store, half an hour away, well, that closed down and nothing else opened to replace it. Or, people essentially having more and more trouble, making rent. And look, I don't mean to say like I lived a relatively, economically privileged life. I'm not going to say like, oh, I was starving in the streets. You get the feeling like, oh, something isn't going well. And then the other one that I became very much aware of is that conservatives lose all the time, like consistently. And so the one I really remember was even being in a very, to a certain degree, I wouldn't say sheltered, but a very, I guess, like a very strict religious community. I remember realizing very early on the conservatives weren't going to win it. Like, I don't know if you remember the Romney election in 2012, but
I think I was in fourth grade. Yeah, but I do remember parts of it.
But you just remember the absolute copium going around. Like, oh, we got it this time. We'll get Obama. Like, we're going to turn the country around. I remember looking at him and I'm like, I don't know, man. This guy, not only does he not have it in him, but he just doesn't seem that good. And then with that, and the real hammer blow was Obergefell, right? Where you realize like, oh, like these people have no cultural power anymore. And so very much kind of like the memories of, and I grew up in kind of one of the capitals of the Bible Belt. Like I grew up near Liberty University, near the big, near Jerry Falwell's church. I remember when he died. And so you'd think that that's like kind of like the centers of, conservative Christianity. And again, look, like I make fun of those people because they are kind of funny, but they're good people with good instincts. And there was so much rot that I saw. And I'm not to say like, oh, it was terrible. Like it really was better than almost everywhere else in the US, but you saw like just endless conservative folding and this kind of like retreat. And to me, it just kind of came to the feeling like, wait a minute, like if these eternal quote unquote, because I don't call myself a conservative, but if these conservatives are right, why are they losing? And they're losing in a way that isn't just kind of like, oh, we'll get them next time sport. Like these are massive changes being made to society.
Right. They're losing in ways that aren't just like their lack of organization. They're losing on like every level.
Right, exactly. And so it's like, well, if that matters, if to quote Richard Weaver, if ideas do have consequences, that's damage. You're going to have to repair that damage somehow. And the people who are kind of set up within the system are in no way set up to deal with it. The opposition that you are told, like, oh, this is the way you fix it. Not only do they never really win in any material sense, but when they do have power, they don't do anything with it. And I'm not to say like I was having these like reactionary thoughts explicitly at the time, but it's part of the reason that, and honestly, I realize AA has been making himself kind of unpopular in these circles for a while, but there's something that I really do relate to him about, which is that I am unbelievably contrarian. And so I have to kind of own that. But I do remember like a big part of the reason that I was just not interested in like Republican Party politics as a kid growing up, because it's like, well, you guys always lose. And I don't want to be a loser and say it like that. But that kind of feeling that like, wait a minute, like the culture that I grew up in is fading fast and is being kind of roundly defeated every time it's trotted out. And specifically, right, another thing that you bring up, when we're talking about education. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and just a couple of things before we forget about it. At the beginning, you said like you saw that you were going to like a church, right? And most of the people there had gone through some sort of divorce, and that just automatically does not sit well. I remember thinking in high school before I kind of I had a lot of the same sort of implicit thoughts that you did. I just couldn't articulate them, hadn't read the literature and all this other stuff. But the thought and the spirit was definitely still there. I remember looking at one of the extracurriculars that I was in, and this is an extracurricular that will select for children that probably grow up in broken homes. The more the ones that tend to be slightly more intelligent, but also potentially more argumentative or psychopathic even. Mock trial. I remember looking in that, and out of like the 14 people that were there, there was not one person that came from a like intact family. At some point, you have to realize that maybe this isn't just a coincidence. Perhaps there is something direly wrong here. If and this thing that even selects for this trait is getting a 100% selection rate. If you have a math class in an area with like a strict Asian community, you would expect your math class to be full of Asians. But even if you don't have a strict Asian community in like the heartlands of the U.S., there's probably at least still one, at least in the upper levels of the math. Whenever you start seeing 100%, though, that's usually cause for some sort of concern in somewhere like the United States. Perhaps you've lost that part of the country. So. And just to clarify here, no, this was not it. It was literally just like the divorce rate in like the actual native population of the U.S. The European descendants is very high. So all of these people knew their parents. I believe. I don't think there was anyone that didn't know them. It's just like they had gone through divorce. Their homes were broken. They probably didn't talk to half their family because of that. Family drama that happens during a divorce doesn't just stay with the parents. It gets passed down to the children and grandchildren, all this other stuff just you don't get raised with them, so you don't talk to them. And then by the time more of that stuff sort of cooled down, you don't talk to them again either because it's awkward. So that's just one of the things I thought I would bring up. And then the other one as well was you were talking about sort of like you didn't like the Republicans because they were just losing all the time. And I had something similar, but not quite the same thing, where I didn't like the Republicans because they didn't seem to like stand for anything. They seemed sort of slimy and snake-like because they would, they would say, one part of the party would say something fine in their rhetoric. Whether or not they did anything was a completely other topic that 8th grade me wasn't really concerned about, just because that's a lot of things to look through for an 8th grader. But then they would nominate someone like Romney or McCain or someone like that would just, completely acquiesce on every social issue if it was unpopular and just give a half-hearted, limp-wristed attempt to keep the social issues that were in question at the time from being subverted, if at all. That's just not attractive. Someone, if you're going to say we are this political group, we are this faction, we are partisans, people are going to join you only if you stand for something. Otherwise it's just, hey, do you want to join the primordial blob of leftism that's left over from 10 years ago? Like no one would want to join that.
Right, exactly. And I think that, and I don't even want to say that I had particularly intelligent thoughts on it because I was kind of fully submerged, at least mentally. And look, when you're a kid, you don't really have the mental capacity to express these things. But I was fully submerged in kind of like the Rush Limbaugh, like boomer con, they hate us for our freedom worldview. Just because, it's what I grew up with, it's what I knew. And thankfully, kind of going to a school with a more rigorous tradition, I was exposed to a pretty wide range of people, with a lot of them kind of coalescing around, let's just say, how do I say this? A lot of people kind of around the like old right talking points, and very also connected to kind of American Civil War revisionism, things like that. You don't have to say that it was a monolith, but one of the other things that really pushed me down was that I saw the rot hit my school. So I went to a school with a student body of roughly 100 in high school. So graduating class of 30. And don't get me wrong, like within that, like my fiance, my roommate, the majority of my friends came from that, because obviously when you spend, years and years with the same 15 guys, you get to know them. But what happened is essentially like the kind of creeping managerialism hit there too. So the dean of the school, great guy, ex-army, very, I guess intellectually interested in, like the project of Christian scholasticism. The intro to my show actually shows scenes from his favorite movie. The Henry V, Kenneth Branagh film, which is just a little kind of an homage to him. But he ended up getting fired, and when he got fired, they kind of brought in new management, and the new management changed things dramatically. So they brought in a new kind of head teacher, which is at my school like an academic or like a admin position that's kind of under like front office admin, kind of representing the teachers. And this guy started out his career as kind of a Jeb Bush Republican, and then ended up going kind of well after I graduated, ended up going kind of full libtard. But what happened was when the management changed, the standards dropped dramatically. And what happened was that because I was in 10th grade, so it was exactly halfway through high school when this happened, they essentially kept the standards for everyone who had gone through the original system, more or less, just because it was like, well, we already started, we can't change it. And then behind that group, and I'm not meaning to say that everything's worse after I left, but it's just I was right on the cusp of it, so I could really see I had 2 years before, 2 years after, and I kind of stayed with the original system. That, as soon as that one guy who was really holding out against the tide, like he was the one, actively making the decision to keep standards high, to, make discipline harsh. And he was an incredibly harsh disciplinarian, and everyone loved him for it. Standards just fell apart. And once standards fell apart, the student body fell apart. So it went from a school in which, like, if you forgot to, raise the flags at the beginning of the morning, you'd get to miss first period because you were doing push-ups in the snow until you vomited, which
Right,
admittedly is kind of good for a bunch of guys, because it teaches you discipline. Two, it's kind of the only thing that can get through your 16-year-old skull, because you're not really that bright at that age. And then it goes to when he goes, the standards of discipline goes, and then it's like, well, what are you going to do to me? Like, you're some, essentially like effeminate, 5'8", fat balding man, and you're going to tell me I should feel bad about this? Like, of course not. If you don't have anything to back it up with. And so that was another thing where it's like, I saw a place that was kind of very much different, standing against kind of the, the broader, like the broader trends. And all it took was one man to leave, one man to just take his place, and the whole thing collapsed. And so that was a microcosm, right? That was my community, and I watched it get subverted.
Right, and this ties into something that I've noticed as well, and it astounds me. You have these Christians that will run these businesses as a specifically, or any, doesn't have to be a business, it could be education, like a Christian school. As an explicitly Christian area with Christian standards and Christian discipline and Christian morals, all this other stuff that you usually hear with a Christian business or school. And then they don't realize that that's what makes them unique. So as soon as you acquiesce even part of that, to start looking like the world around you, you lose what draws people to you, because you're no longer different or special. You're just another one, this time with like maybe a Christian coat of paint, if you still have that by the end. So you have these Christian schools that will lower their standards, that will make everything nicer, and it'll be less of a barrier to entry for the rest of the community to enter. And then, shocker, the standards decline. People stop sending their kids there because the reputation has been sullied. They aren't really that high of standards. Their results plummet. The Christianity kind of just becomes an afterthought. So then you have your sort of diehard believers questioning if the school really is even Christian. Usually you'll see your first round of zealous parents pulling their children out as soon as standards lower. It astounds me that people can't just see this basic fact. If you have a Christian school in a community where the only other schooling options are the public schools where, they let children have sex in the bathrooms at like the age of 14 or something like that, or you have drugs flowing through the public bathrooms, where you have, who knows whatever else you find. My list on Academic Agents channel is just one snapshot. Who the hell knows what you would find if you went to New York or something like that. They don't realize they're different than all that because of the standards they have. And it just astounds me. At my Lutheran school, I remember whenever I was much younger, they would definitely expel a lot of people. The standards were much higher. You basically had a bunch of like really old people managing half the stuff, and it doesn't matter what they wrote down on paper. The actual enforced standards would be much higher than you would find anywhere else. And then, wouldn't you know it, all of the results turned out much better. People tended to be much more solid, even if they weren't explicitly Christian. They would at least act like it. And then by the time I had reached the age of the 8th graders and the older people that I was observing when I was much younger, those standards had basically just completely collapsed. A lot of the old people had been cycled out. We got a couple of very good replacements, but we didn't get people that were willing to enforce those high standards. So by the time I was looking at the people that came after me, getting into the public high school that I went into, just because there was no private high school where I was at, they were indistinguishable from the people that had just gone through the public schools. That should have been a wake-up call, but it was not. So it astounds me.
And I think that it was an interesting microcosm, not to say like, oh, it was the end of the world, but you kind of get a firsthand, I guess, you get a firsthand lesson in subversion, and these are things that should be like, this should be the solution, and you see, and it got much, much worse, during the pandemic. And so you look at that initially and you're like, oh, well, this is a trend. This is because of this one guy. I just hate that guy, because it's the first thing you see and you kind of instinctively react against it, and then you kind of pick your head up and you're like, wait a minute, why is everything else following the same path? Why is everything going in the same direction? And to me, that's kind of when I started to notice the cracks in like the mainstream. And I'm talking about liberal in the Western liberal tradition, not like, libtards. But you start to notice the cracks in the ideology of the marketplace of ideas, right? Because you would assume, given kind of like a bell curve of human expression, that you could generally find an average school, an average college, and it might be pretty similar. But there should be some difference. Why should I be almost completely assured that if I went to Stanford, Yale, University of South Carolina, Berkeley, I would essentially be taught the same ideology? Because really you shouldn't, if you're operating within kind of like the liberal paradigm. And so you start to look at it and you're like, wait a minute, this isn't a fair game. This isn't what I have been sold. And so then you're realizing, like, wait a minute, like, not only am I not fighting on the level playing field that I thought I was, quote unquote, fighting on, but there are some core assumptions that have to be examined. And so a lot of my personal influences are, I would say, like older millennials, so people who are currently in their early 40s to late 30s, kind of like the upper half of that generation. People actually roughly Bagby's age. He's one of them. And a lot of those people kind of grew up with it kind of came to their own during the Ron Paul revolution. And look, like, I still have a good deal of sympathy for Dr. Paul. He's a good man, and I think that maybe he doesn't see the whole picture, but he's a whole lot more right than wrong. And a lot of those people, they kind of got it, in the sense that a lot of them are what Rod Dreher would call crunchy cons. And look, Rod Dreher is kind of a goofy guy, but that term is a good one. And essentially, a lot of those people realize, like, wait a minute, this system of social atomization and endless consumption is unsustainable, and not in the kind of like airy fairy, like I use paper bags when I go to the grocery store kind of way, but really like this endless like cascade of selfish choices. Like, I will choose this for me, like that. that cannot go on. And you come to a certain point where you are no longer human. And so to me, that was kind of another like first, I guess, like crack in the facade, where it's like, wait a minute, like we really need to examine the kind of like principles along which humans are organized along. And the thing that I think is hard when you're kind of raised in a more, libertarian tradition is the realization that just giving people choices does not produce good outcomes at all, because people will essentially choose, that which like fires the most neurons, which activates that like lizard
For the
part
least
of your brain.
effort.
Exactly. And you look at that and you're like, okay, well, maybe there's some percentage.
Ooh. Are you still there? Am I still there?
Brian's gone. Oh, you're back
Ooh.
now. Okay.
Yeah, okay.
There's some portion of the population for which they can kind of operate with that additional degree of, quote unquote freedom. But that's a diminishingly small percentage of the population. And so the idea that, we're going to get out of this by just increasing choice, I realize, and that's an old idea in these circles, but to me at the time was incredibly revolutionary. And so when you look at it, and I get kind of frustrated with certain segments of the right, and you see this in the kind of like the manosphere, you see this with a lot of people who are kind of unduly obsessed with, should we say, ethnic subversion, where they look at it and they say, all of the problems inherent to the West, they're exogenous. Like they're not from us. Like if we could just get these people out, it'd be fine. But to me, I kind of look at it and look, those are real problems. I'm not denying that at all. But there's a certain part of it where we're victims of our own success. We created a system in which we could make choices that would have gotten, people killed 10 generations ago. And you can make those semi-sustainable life choices. Sorry. And so to me, it's like, I don't know like how much of this social atomization can really be blamed and how much of it is really our choice. Like when you have the option to, drive 30 minutes away, to a big box grocery store if you live in the country because it's cheaper, instead of supporting the local greengrocer a mile down the road. And then that goes out of business. You've lost a pillar of your community, and now you and your neighbors don't see each other anymore. Everyone just drives, to something that's more convenient to them. Like that was a choice you made. And look, I get it. You can't control for everyone, but this kind of broad social atomization, I think that we've been seeing, obviously the rate of change has increased dramatically, but these roots were laid down a long time ago.
Right. And something that I think that we should, just very clearly point out here, because it sounds counterintuitive, but when you think about it for about 5 minutes, it suddenly doesn't become so. If you atomize a population and break them down to the individual level, that population will be perfectly homogenous to whoever has the most power to guide those atoms. Whoever can scoop up the most people and push them towards something, you're basically unopposed. You don't have things like religious identity, racial identity, cultural or geographical identity to get in your way. If you have the media, if you have the printing press, if you have the state, if you have anything else that would function in a similar manner, people that are atomized are much easier to homogenize and control wherever you need them to. Everywhere else, they can just be their own individual, spurgs.
Well, right, and I've just started Propaganda by Alul, and he makes largely the same point, where it's like, look, like when people become like, once you break down a mass of people to individuals, you kind of aren't really dealing with individuals anymore. You're dealing with averages, really, because it doesn't really matter what one individual person does. It matters what kind of like the central, I guess, mean can be motivated to do or motivated to accept. And so as you kind of break down those, I guess, those kind of social ties, it becomes easier and easier to kind of use pure power alone. And I think that the game that the left has been playing, if we can broadly like categorize the left, is they have essentially always traded kind of destruction, dissolution of the system, of society, for additional power and money. Because much like you said, like you can, it becomes much easier to exercise power when people are disillusioned. And so you can see throughout time, like there's always power to be gained from, breaking social institutions. Like a little bit of power is released when you do that. And so the problem is that the degradation that results from that kind of like shake up of society is not a linear curve. There are certain things that you can kind of you can let slide. So the analogy I've used for this is if you have, the oil cap on your car open and the car's running, if you drop 1 grain of sand in there, like one little bit of corruption, your car's going to be fine. Realistically, it's not great. You shouldn't do it, but it'll probably be fine. And 2 is probably the same. But the moment you start adding, handfuls of the stuff, you're going to start to see the system grind to a halt. And the problem is that, this kind of like degradation is cumulative. So every generation you add a little bit more and you're still dealing with the knock-on effects from last generation's leftists. And so to me, it's, at least like from my perspective, our chickens have kind of come home to roost very suddenly. And I'm kind of eternally taking swings at, the James Lindsays, the David Frenches of the world, because I truly can't stand these people, because they've accepted kind of the core premise that there's something wrong about modernity. But in their kind of like limited blindered view, the problem is essentially everything that happened after Bill Clinton or everything that happened after George W. Bush. And to me, it's like, this is not really a sustainable solution. So sorry, I believe I've gotten well and truly off.
No. I'm quite enjoying this. If I didn't want you to speak, I would change topic or mute you or cut you off. So, but by all means, please going.
Yeah, you've run this like a theocrat. That's how I run my channel, right? But to me, at least, there's this kind of, and I know that anyone who's made it this far probably doesn't suffer under those illusions. But in the chance that someone who's kind of a middle of the line conservative is listening to this, my big thought is like, well, okay, let's say you manage to turn the dial back to 1992 or 1984, anything like that. One, I don't think you can. You can never. There is a synthesis. I realize that Hegel has a kind of a dirty name in these spheres, but nonetheless, like there is always a synthesis. You can't get around that. You can never really go back upstream. But also, the very fact that we didn't stay in a stable state in the 90s culture or the 80s culture or the 50s culture, well, that indicates there was something wrong in that culture. It wasn't a stable system. And so the point is, like, if we consider the right wing to be the side of order, to be the side of stability, well, merely going back to kind of a hybrid system that has just as much of the corruption as we would like personally, like, oh, we can still have birth control because I like birth control, or oh, we can still have, the kind of like atomized nuclear family living in, like perfect, little suburbs where they don't have to deal with anything unpleasant.
Right, yeah. Pornography is legal, abortion's legal, contraception is legal, the gay rights movement is kicking off. But it's fine, though, because we haven't gotten the really new bad thing that would come during my lifetime that would ruin everything.
Well, right. And so it comes back to the point I made about COVID, which is like, oh, if we're going to have to make a change here, we're going to have to give up something we don't like. And so look, you have an economics background. I have a finance background, which is essentially the same thing.
Yeah. In the university system, one is just slightly more abstract than the other. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. You get the exact same shade of autism in both. Yeah. And so one of the kind of like the core economic principles that I think is essential for people to understand is that of the trade-offs, right? There is no such thing as a choice for which you don't give something up. There's opportunity cost. By virtue of making a decision, you're giving up the ability to do something else. And so, all right, well, we are in a society that has kind of maximized itself along the lines of, personal autonomy and personal satisfaction, right? You personally can do pretty much whatever you want. You can kind of feed your vices in whatever way you want. And that came with a huge cost. It came to a cost of social cohesion. People live meaningless lives. Like Thomas said, this is kind of a pointless society. People essentially exist to be matter.
Right.
It's not a particularly good life. And so if you look at that and you say, like, all right, that's not good. That's bad. I don't like that. Well, you're going to have to give something up. And what you're going to have to give up is that autonomy, is that kind of like feeling of I can do whatever I want, whenever I want. And really, like I think that especially his recent work has been absolutely egregious. Like his conservative manifesto was just a dumpster fire of the English language. But Peterson kind of gets at this. I think this is kind of like the core truth in him, and the reason so many people latched onto him is the idea that, like, well, if you are going to get anything good, you're gonna have to suffer. And so much of the meaning in life comes from, I guess, from suffering and from, to a certain extent, like your social bonds to others.
Right. Before we move on to Peterson, because I had two Peterson topics written down on this thing over here from the opening. I wanted to let's talk about the idea of declining standards must mean that people will decline, because there is the people could just decide to keep the same standards themselves in personal discipline, even regardless if they stop being told to socially or by the state or whatnot. It's just they don't. And I remember I disagreed with academic agent once in a discussion or an argument where he said, the free market is basically the elimination of any and all standards, which means that it's going to lead to what you're doing, what you have going on right now. And I remember telling him that we had a much less regulated market for 2 centuries or so, and we didn't have this gigantic decline. Going into the 1800s to part of the 1900s. You didn't have nearly as much inhibition on business. So what you did have, though, you didn't necessarily have as many state inhibitions on trade or the commerce. But you did have things like extreme church power. You had much more devolved local governmental interdiction. So like you can even take this to the state level, just the sort of the thing that would be least likely to prove my argument. You would have states in the United States that had established churches where tax money went to supporting the established church. You had a state like Missouri that made it legal to kill Mormons, which were seen as an alien invader. And that was on the books until 1976, if I remember correctly.
That's one of my favorite bits of American trivia to shock the Euros with.
Yeah.
Like, wait, that was on your laws? I'm like, yes, and it was great.
And it wasn't just on the laws; it was encouraged. But like this is the thing: local government could very well uphold a standard one way or the other. Like in Missouri, technically, it was getting rid of a standard, no murder. But it was specifically to make sure that the society wouldn't collapse. So in that sense, I guess it is increasing a standard by preventing people from exercising a religion. And then with state churches in the Northeast, the Massachusetts State Church would be the longest one to last until like 1838, if I remember correctly. There's very obviously going to be social standards that come along from the church that is not legislated or necessarily even enforced by the state. So you can have whatever commercial system you like. It's just you have all of these other institutions which are almost entirely separate from people buying and selling goods that would uphold these standards. So in that sense, I think academic agent was right in spirit, in that if you got rid of these standards, people are just going to go to the path of least resistance. It's just it wasn't trade policy that was preventing the West from falling apart. It was I would definitely say it was the religious sphere, prevented with the social and the political power that it held for the longest time. Churches just had the independent power, either informally or formally in some areas of the West, to keep standards high.
That's well said, and it's that kind of strikes at one of my core, I guess, annoyances with the libertarian sphere, and I pick at them a lot because I come from that tradition to a certain extent. And I don't mean to say that there's not good stuff there, right? Hoppe's great, Rothbard's great, Mises is great within his,
if we didn't care, we wouldn't talk about them.
Right, exactly. But there's this idea that kind of it pulls the free market out of its context, like you said, and I noticed this also actually with the libertarian Second Amendment activists, that they pull the right to bear arms out of its context. And to be honest, those are cultural values, and they are values for a culture with expectations attached to them within a culture, right? And when you change the culture, and I mean both on a a genetic level and just a kind of like you change the expectations, it's really no shock that those things kind of break down, because they were built on a kind of a deep foundation of other principles that were never really explicitly stated, but were nonetheless kind of like important to that idea. So for instance, right, and I was talking to Mr. Patriarch about this on Twitter a while back, and he basically brought up the question of like, okay, which nation has the best salesman, has the best sales ethic? And what we were talking about is that America has a ethos to sales, right? There's a reason that in kids' cartoons, the slimy car salesman is a stock character. Like it's Pete from from the Disney cartoons. He pours sawdust in the radiator. And the reason
and then you have like the corresponding good archetype of like the family businessman who's very honest, just wants to do good business, usually used in sort of like the the free market propaganda films from the 50s. So you get both sides.
But there's this cultural idea of the fair deal. Like, look, I've done sales my entire life. I've sold, collector cars. I've sold on my own. And while there's always a certain amount of like haggling going on, there's this idea on both ends that if you ask too much or offer too little, that is a slight to the other person. And so there's obviously like a certain range. Like, okay, you'll quibble a little bit, but like if I come to you and this car is worth $10,000 and I offer you $2,000, the most common practice is for you to show me the door. Like, I don't even want your money. Get out. Because there's kind of a cultural idea of like fair and honest business practice. Whereas in more haggling cultures, and we can kind of draw the like Indiana Jones,
Here, like, we can use an example if you want one that won't get us banned off of YouTube. Romania.
yeah, the Roma, barely human. That's a joke.
I was thinking just Romanians, but yeah, okay.
Sorry, I must have misheard you. They're technically human, I think, but that's a completely different, I guess, like system of values. And so when you just have the free market, in capital letters, it's this kind of like floating disembodied, I guess, system. You miss the kind of underlying cultural values that made that work. And look, I don't mean to say that people have always been, moral in their business dealings. By no means, right? Like I've been reading a book off and on for months, which means that I read 90% of it and haven't finished it. North Against South by Johnson. And a large part of it is essentially chronicling the rise of, the lobbying state and the rise of essentially like these business shysters who would get government contracts from the union and sell horrible, shoddy goods to the government. So that's always been there. I'm not going to deny that. But the idea that you can separate concepts like the free market or like the right to bear arms from kind of the cultural strata from which they grew out of, I think is a huge mistake. And so if you look at kind of like modern boomer cons, and I love this analogy that, Dave the Distributus has used of ghost dancing, right? With the idea that, when the Plains Indians were being, driven from their homes, they were really being kind of like hammered by the cavalry.
When they were on the reservations, like they had fully lost, their homelands were gone, the buffalo was gone, everything was gone, they were just on reservations. Yeah, keep going.
Well, what did they do? Well, they focused all of their attention instead on, maybe like building up military power or, building up political power. Well, they just focused all of their energy into more and more elaborate, essentially like religious rituals. So these are the ghost dance, the spirit dance, whatever you will. And that's not particularly important what it actually was. But the point is that it's the psychological defense mechanism where, well, we've lost. We're losing. We didn't always lose. We used to be on top. And what did we do when we're on top? Well, we did spirit dances. So if we just do spirit dances extra hard, we'll win. And so you see this with the boomer.
And there's an extra layer that might be good to mention here. These were spirit dances meant to bring back their wealth in the form of buffalo, their way of life. So you have these elaborate religious rituals that were literally kind of just invented on the spot that was meant to bring back, the good times of before.
Right, exactly. And so I think you see much the same thing with kind of like the boomer conservatives' worship of, my guns, my free market, my constitution. Because when those things were kind of broadly respected, less so with guns, because the whole gun control thing is a newer, not to say new, but is a newer facet of kind of like the American right. But when all of those were, widely accepted values, we were good. So if we just did it again, if we worshiped the Constitution more, if we just said free market's good more, well, we win again. And look, none of those are individually like inherently bad things, but it misses a broader, I guess, a broader theme that like, look, like there was rot. There was something that caused those ideas to fall away. And just the idea of believing in them won't fix the rot behind it. It's like putting
Right. It's the difference between emotionalism and realism.
right. And I get a lot of when I do get bad feedback, one of the most common ones I get is that, oh, you're black pilled. Like, oh, you're so down on America. You know, you think everything's terrible. And look, like I love my home. I wish that my home was doing great. Like if we were headed for the, you know, the 1,000-year, based, American
Based
right,
realm. Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
great, like awesome. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not going to lie to you. And the idea that unless you're willing to lie, you're black pilled is, to be honest, it's retarded. Stop it. You know, like, look, there's no sense in like the endless, like kind of like self-seeking nihilism of don't do anything, it doesn't matter. That's a mistake. But the idea that you need to like lie to yourself to enter like the Turley copium den forever, like get that out of your head. It's stupid.
I don't even know how much of a Turley is copium. The last time I interacted with him, he said we were going for the base right-wing utopia of Mormon United States, which sounds closer to dystopia than to me. But yeah.
To be honest, I'll put it this way: I can't imagine how the Mormons would be worse. So
Well,
you know what? If they win, fair enough.
I mean, the last time that they had uninhibited power, they were executing people and literally taking their children to indoctrinate them into Mormonism. So I don't like them that much.
Look, at least they're pretty. You know, they're good looking. Our current crop
Yeah.
is hideous homunculus people. So you know, if we're gonna get put on the cattle train, so to speak, at least at least our prison guards will be good looking, and you know that's something, I guess.
Yeah. So that's one aspect. Now, not to like just brush that issue off. Yeah, we've done really good there. Unfortunately, our time is not infinite. So I did want to ask you because you and I are around the same age. You are much older, or not much older. You are older than I am. What was it, by 5 years, 4 years?
Yeah, so I'm 23.
Okay, yeah, 4 years. So, you would have been, right at the end of high school by the time I was about to get into it. So,
okay,
you're basically that cohort removed from me. You mentioned earlier the quality of education has manifestly declined, and you have witnessed it. And for once, I am not the only person on this channel making this point. Just saying, believe me, I've seen it. Now we can say, believe you, you've seen it. What have you seen, Mr. Burden, in the quality of education?
Okay, so there are two categories. There's broader higher education, which has declined, and then there's the COVID apocalypse, in which that essentially after COVID, and especially during COVID, what standards remained just detonated. So before, and again, like I said, I did a stream on this fairly recently, but I assume this is a slightly different audience. When I went to, kind of like the prestigious, allegedly, very difficult to get into, very high standards. Like I'll put it this way. I think that the average admissions for that school was a 3.9 GPA. So like a pretty academic set. And I was taught essentially drivel there. So I had, some professors who were better than others, but
right. Give us some examples. Yeah. Because like I say this all the time as well. And people are like, yeah, but what does that mean?
So for instance, right, when I went to this school, they had a mandatory kind of like freshman seminar. And what it was essentially, it was a subject specific writing kind of boot camp. And so the idea is obviously a lot of kids going into college are not very good writers. And so this is a kind of like a way to get new students up to academic standards of writing. And we'll kind of do that. We'll hook them by having it be on an interesting topic. So in the time I was in the business school there, and it was a pretty good program. And that they basically gave me a page of options, and one of them was game theory. So I saw game theory and I was like, awesome, economic game theory, sick, I can do that. What it was, and I didn't know this, it was critical theory of video games. And they really buried the lead there. And my professor essentially taught me a 16-week class on Gamergate, which incidentally I completely missed, but this woman unintentionally radicalized me. Like, that's how I found Sargon of Akkad, is that I literally got shown Sargon of Akkad in class as a racist, vile misogynist. And I was like, I don't know, man, I like him more than you. And so, for instance, in this, I'll give several examples, which is one, for my final project, I was given a piece of quote unquote art to analyze. And look, like, I play video games. I wouldn't really consider myself a regular player. Like, I find some, nerdy single player RPG every once in a while and, play it. But I wouldn't say it's a regular part of my life. But, I know the culture, and especially in high school, I played a lot of games. And I was assigned Mrs. Pac-Man. And I was supposed to write, I think it was 15 pages of analysis on Mrs. Pac-Man, which is incredibly difficult. So I decided to make an incredibly ethical choice and completely fabricate my argument from whole cloth. There was absolutely nothing to my argument. And my argument was, we can determine from Mrs. Pac-Man that there is a misogynistic trope in Japanese culture that women can't control themselves around food. Because look at Mrs. Pac-Man. She eats all the time. And I had no sources for this. I literally just made it up. I made it up. It's stupid. It's not true.
Let me guess, 95%.
Yes. And after that, I was like, oh no, what's wrong? Like, this is supposedly an institution.
Wait, you actually got 95%?
I got a 90. I got an A, point being. I can't remember what
okay,
I got.
All right.
An A on it. And I was literally sitting there and I was like, what in the world? Like, what is wrong? I deserve to fail. And so that class was largely a disaster. And so that's kind of background, just academic chaos, academic low standards. And at that school, we had a group of militant vegans. Okay, that was kind of funny. We had a group of militant vegans that would like smash up the dining hall. There was kind of like consistent, just like rampant, like low-level left-wing terrorism. And the crazy thing about this, beyond that, is that the school that I went to had and I don't want to hurt your channel. It had a Me Too scandal. And to be perfectly fair, it was a real Me Too scandal. There was a fraternity that was, coercing people into sex by, spiking their drinks, which is obviously
And they had witnesses?
Yes, it was actually like
rare. Okay, yeah, it's an actual scandal.
It wasn't people got kicked out of school. People served hard time for it, and it seems like they deserved to serve hard time for it, right? I don't know the guys, but I'm going to go out on a limb here, say something really brave. Rape is bad. I realize that's a minority position, but
I can't. How anti-Nietzsche and anti-Evolian of you! The will to power requires the consent be eschewed.
Right. There's a joke there that I won't go into. Anyway, and so they'd understandably reacted to that. But when I went to school there, I had an 8-day freshman orientation, which is incredibly long, and this freshman orientation was essentially a struggle session. They separated all of the men and men-identifying people in the school, stuffed them in a dark auditorium with a massive blue-haired feminist, and then we were taught sex ed, which involved just showing us porn. We were told that we were like they literally did the meme of like 30% of men were rapists.
They did what?
They literally showed us sex ed. And part of it was like obviously not from a porn site, but produced like pornographic film where it would be like everyone was handed clickers and like a sexual scenario would play out and it'd be like, press the button when consent was violated. And I was just sitting there in class. I was like, oh dear God, what am I doing here? Like, this is not real. And
this happened.
And I remember one of the funniest ones, because of course, after a while, people started to kind of rebel against it. And there were things where it was essentially like, okay, guys, we want your honest opinions. And it was questions like, what do you consider, what counts as sex? And it was a list of, and I won't, read them out, but you can imagine like certain sexual behaviors. And so, of course, everyone said none of it. It was just like people like, messing with the coordinator. But the point is like, this was intense indoctrination. Like they did the thing, that stat like, 1 in 3 men is a rapist. Look to your left, look to your right. One of them is a rapist.
Like half of all women on this campus have been raped.
Exactly. And so I after that, and to be fair, one of the other things I should say is I was a very different person. I was 18. I was pretty impressionable, and it kind of did a number on me. If I'm going to be honest, it really put me into a headspin. because I wasn't really used to that level of conditioning. And it all culminated at this moment when we were supposed to essentially sign a pledge. And they brought us to an old cathedral that had all of its windows removed, all of its Christian symbols removed, but it still had kind of like the altar. And at the front, there was a guy, and he was an avowed Muslim. And he gave a lesson from the Quran, drenched in kind of shit-lived talking points from the front of a church. And at that point, like,
okay, just to paint the schizophrenia of this scenario.
Yeah.
It's a lib teaching from the Quran.
Yep.
In a hollowed out church. All right, let's keep going. That's the setting for people to imagine this world.
And everyone there was forced to sign a contract, which I hate to admit I did sign, which featured a wide variety of commitments we made, including a commitment to challenge and upend the tenets of traditional masculine or Western masculinity. I had to sign that to go to school there. And I'm ashamed to say that I did it. I cucked on it. But after that, I kind of had this realization. It's like, oh, like this. Not only is there something wrong, but these people are my enemies. And so that was really a radicalization moment for me, because I was kind of like, and I did, I when I dropped out, I sent an email saying, why I did it. A big part of it was that contract. I threw I threw the like little challenge coin I got, and I burned my copy of the contract. It's kind of like I fully renounced that. But my point is, okay,
did you tell them in the email to rot in hell?
I did not, because I was not quite as a giga-based ultra right-wing mega chad that I am now. But so my point is,
excuses.
Yeah. My point is, there's something weird going on in schools. And look, that was a small liberal arts school. When I went to state schools, there were different problems. They weren't quite those problems, but it was really like 5 years behind that. And so to me, that really put me in a tailspin. Like, I did drop out of school because I was like, do I even want to go to college? Like, I don't even know, like, what am I? Why am I here? And so my point is, like, that's not just kind of kooky stuff. Like, oh, they're doing a sit-in in the library to get, representation on student council, the kind of like background, student libtard stuff we've seen for, at this point, generations. Like, there's something really dark going on. And I don't know, like, to me, that at least, like, that showed me kind of like the rot in higher ed. And this was before COVID. So both, obviously, academic standards are low. Conduct standards are non-existent. And the actual admin is kind of a willing participant to this.
Yeah, so that was hopefully now, if anyone was unsure about the things that I was saying a year ago, I have someone now that is 4 years older than me, even from the other side of the country, basically talking about the exact same things, if not worse, on the basically closer to the Atlantic seaboard. So, hopefully some people can kind of get the picture if they were skeptical beforehand. There was another aspect, though. So obviously we have educational decline in what is taught, but surely that's not the only place where education standards have declined. Test taking, evaluations, rigor, anything like that might have.
Oh yeah, so definitely. So I was always I was a good test taker. I did very well on standardized testing, and so maybe I'm biased, right? But what's interesting is that we've started to see a movement in higher ed, and I'm actually curious. Did you have to send test scores into your school?
Well, it was optional, hilariously.
Yes,
exactly.
It
was the ACT, and it was optional.
Yeah, I've always been I think the ACT is a much better test. The SAT is highly subverted.
Yeah, at one point in time, the SAT was better, but no longer.
And so essentially there's been this move, and I have problems with standardized testing from a certain perspective that I think it is, kind of managerial and I guess like overly metrics based. But all the same, it is a metric to go off of. So for the sake of discussion, it's a useful one, right? But the idea that in an age of, and this is another problem, that we're facing widespread grade inflation at the high school level. So essentially, there's been this trend, and you can see it, that now the average grade given out has gone from a C to essentially a B plus. And what this has meant is that GPAs are largely worthless because everyone has a 4.0 or everyone has a 3.5 because almost the entire right half of the bell curve is getting A's. And so that should lead to a more, I guess, more heavy reliance on standardized testing because those things are harder to inflate. There has been some inflation, but it's a hard test. Very few people get a perfect 1600 on their SAT or a perfect, is it a 40 on the ACT? I can't remember.
36, something like that.
36, yeah.
36 sounds right.
Of course, it's an odd number, but you get my point. And so, okay, even if it's not as hard as it used to be, still very few people get a perfect score, so it's a better measure than nothing. But what happened is schools, in a bid to essentially increase diversity, have essentially waived that requirement. So, it's optional. You don't have to, which means, of course, that, if your only metric for getting in is your GPA, which is essentially fake at this point, everyone has the same GPA, so no one has a bad GPA.
Right, yeah. Well, if you fail people, you get less funding. So you're not going to fail people, and if people get higher grades, you get more funding.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so I've also seen this because I've mentioned a few times that my fiance is a public school teacher. So she got her first year in at one of the worst schools in my state. So Richmond is a very rough town. I think it's the 10th most dangerous city in America. And there were 22 elementary schools. One burned down. And so she was at 21 of 21, worst elementary school in the state, or in the city, effectively the state. And what she saw is that not only is there an absence of standards, but essentially what COVID did, and because COVID has essentially supercharged all of these effects, that on the lower end, we're seeing a problem where these kids are essentially feral, right? They don't really have parents that are around, and to be honest, I feel a lot of sympathy for these kids because their parents are drug addicts. Their parents are, even if they're around, they're working multiple jobs, they're on welfare. And so they don't get a lot of parental attention. And obviously you wouldn't want their primary socialization metric to be at a public school, but to be honest, it's better than nothing. But when these kids are third graders who have never been in a school building, have never done anything other than, look at an iPad, these kids can't read. These kids can't sit still for an hour. Some of these kids essentially are don't know how to interact with humans. They're feral children.
And this isn't like the homeschooling thing where it's like, oh, it's because of the Prussian school model. I don't know many people that can turn themselves into, bright flashing pixels of color that generate dopamine for children.
Right. And look, I'm even saying that the Prussian school model is probably not the best one, but we're even within that paradigm, we're seeing catastrophically worse results than we were even 10 or 15 years ago.
So this restlessness is not the normal type of restlessness.
Right. And so, like I've said before, I have a lot of friends who are teachers. Bagby's a teacher. One of my other, long-term mentors is a teacher. My fiance is a teacher. And so these people, in many cases, have had, 20 years of experience with kids. And so, look, obviously, there's always this, kind of human temptation to say like, oh, things are getting worse. Standards are declining. And I get that. But the problem is when you have a multitude of data points all saying like, yeah, I'm leaving teaching because I can't get through to kids. Kids are uninterested, even at, high-end private schools, kids are uninterested in talking through narratives. They're so focused on technology, even in schools where technology isn't allowed, that it's warped their perception of everything. And look, technology has always been addictive, but by virtue of not being locked in your house for 2 years, if you had strict parents, there's kind of a limit that okay, you can't really, obviously people do, but it's much harder to spend, a full 12 hours on your screen when you have work to go to, you have school to go to. But when all of that is already on a screen, the addiction is jacked, way through the roof. And so to me, you're kind of seeing a perfect storm of standards are declining due to ideology, because there's been a huge ideological push. And also the kids themselves are fried, just absolutely fried. And so to me, it seems like obviously there's been a long decline in the school system really since the 60s, right? I mean, it's what Pete has been talking about, that there's been rough schools and really rough schools for a long time. But what we're seeing is even within the people who work within that distorted system is a measurable decline in 2 to 3 years. And I mean, someone in the chat was saying, well, look at how like testable current kids are. Look at the decline. I get it. Look, I completely agree with you. Like things are really rough right now.
Right. And so on your end, so we have what the teachers are saying is currently happening. How were things declining more on like the sort of testing, grades, academic side when you were there? Because I remember whenever COVID hit, they threw tests online, and you could basically just Google every answer. There was no learning. You just Googled the answers on the assignments, turn them in, get hundreds, go to the test. It's online. Google the answers, turn them in, get hundreds, and then you're graduated.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, I quite literally did that. So I was really lucky that I had 1 or 2 professors who were really good and were determined to make school hard. So for instance, they would do things like, yes, you have to do an online test, but you only have 45 minutes to finish it. So you just can't Google in that time, right? Like you have to do the work, show your work. So like there were some teachers.
You can't Google in that time.
I mean, man, when you're doing a 14-step TVM problem, you're not Googling that.
Okay, all right, yeah. I don't know. I was handed like a test where it was like you had less than a minute for each question, and like you had to write out short answers for things, and somehow I still managed to Google and write out the answer.
And look, sure. I know what you mean. I've done it too. And so there were professors who made it work. But in school, when they sent us home, a lot of professors just got really lazy. And so what they would do is they would, instead of making their own materials, they would look far and wide for whatever they could find that kind of worked, or they would let the textbook provider write the questions. And so a lot of them were just computer generated. So I have a photo on my phone, which I can't send. It'll be where I essentially was answering a math problem. And the auto generation software had written a problem and given out of 4 multiple choice answers, 3 of them were the same number. I was like, wait a minute, this isn't fair. Like, I know which one's the right answer. And of course, it was one of that number, but I picked the wrong one. So I got the question wrong. And there was no one to go to because
it's not looking for the answer you give. It's looking for, did you pick A, B, C, or D? And when B, C, and D are the same answer, you have to pick the correct B, C, or D to get the credit.
Exactly. And so that's a stupid example, but I had that, widespread. Like I had, essentially professors who would literally just copy tests from, like I had when I got my degree at community college, I did a liberal arts, liberal arts degree for my 2-year, and it wasn't particularly difficult in the grand scheme of things. I did it in essentially like a year. But what happened was that one of my professors who had to take a history course just copied all his test materials from, the AP history exam of 2016, which means that I found the exact same document he copied it from and would literally just pull one up in one tab, pull his test up in the other, and go down the test and got perfect hundreds on everything because I had his test key.
Right, and you have to remember, this isn't like old cheating where the fraternity has like an Indiana Jones adventure where you find the professor's office unlocked while he's on for a walk, and you have 5 minutes to find the test key, and then you can cheat.
Memorize all the answers. Yeah.
No, this is you have it up in one tab, and you have the quiz up or the test up in the other, and you just copy and paste everything onto the test, and you get 100 in like 2 minutes.
Well, and really, there was something that my university did that really saved me. I think a lot of ones did as well, where they moved over the pandemic to pass-fail. And so basically what you could do is you could select an option to take a course as pass-fail. It would not impact your GPA. And so at the time, I was really, going through the meat of, my degree, taking really hard courses. And I was taking a coding course, and I am an abominable coder. I cannot make my brain do it. And especially since we're using VB Basic, which is a horrible programming language. And the way that this woman had decided to do tests was she would write out handwritten code and make you go through it and correct it by hand, which was miserable. And so, of course, when the university goes to pass-fail, I'm like, great, I'm taking this course pass-fail, which means that I essentially got a 62 in the class by a miracle, I should add, which was a passing grade. Put it pass-fail, because after it's pass-fail, of course, you don't care as long as you're passing because it doesn't affect your GPA. And so obviously, like, you do that for a few semesters, and you have kids, myself included, that just hadn't learned anything, because why would you? Realistically, like, and I realize there's a certain amount of that, this is a moral failing, but if you're taking a course of something like that you're really never going to use in your job, you're doing it to fulfill a degree requirement. Like, I had classes on marketing that I'm never going to use, that were awful. And like,
We
why
might
would
even say satanic.
yeah, exactly. I'm with you on that one, where it's like, well, why care? Because there's no reason to. All caring does is take up more of your time, take up more of your resources for the exact same result. And so, look, like, I'm living witness that, like, standards declined and they produced a worse result. Like, I am a worse result than I would have been had I been to school a few years earlier.
Right, and something else to a lot of this, because we have like that test taking thing. Someone's automatically just going to say, but that's a standardized test, they didn't show anything anyways. Well, that's not entirely true. They didn't show knowledge, but they did show rigor. At the very least, you memorized or failed to memorize the answers. Like, if you're trying to be coldly logical about it, that's what you're proving. Now you don't even have that anymore. You don't even get the mental exercise and memorizing answers and putting them down. It's literally all on Google. I remember, and I didn't cheat on this one, I just did this. The AP tests in 2020, I had, or no, I guess it would have been 2019. Yeah, it sounds better. Because 2019, I was in, English language, the more rhetorical class, and literature analysis class rather than like the writing one. I was in that AP class. I was in AP European history, and I was in AP World history. And that year for the AP tests, because everything was moved online, because God forbid if you go to an in-person place, you're going to catch the plague and die the next day, which I am sure the cure will eventually not do that to you. But for all of those 3 AP exams, all you had to do was basically write one essay on each of them. World history, the literature analysis, and the European history, and that was where your whole grade came from. So I got really lucky. My world history essay was just one essay on, how was modernization or westernization different in these different westernizing countries: the Ottoman Empire, Siberia, the Russian Empire, the Qing Dynasty, Japan, Burma, Afghanistan. All these examples I could just pull out of nowhere just because it's a subject I knew. When I got to literature analysis, some of my friends got a speech by Richard Nixon to analyze. I was unfortunate and did not get good old Nixon. I got Helen Keller. I am still salty to this day.
I am a Helen Keller truther. I am firmly convinced that woman was actually not that woman, because I feel quite bad for her. She's probably just a shambling unfortunate. That nurse is the devil. Yeah. I'm convinced.
I had to analyze something that was supposedly written by Helen Keller. Very easy. I got 5s on both the world history and the literature analysis, which is the perfect score. And then the AP European history. My high school was foaming at the mouth with teachers telling me not to take AP European history because the high school didn't offer it. And they were saying, oh, you can't just do this on your own. You're not going to learn enough and all this other stuff. And I basically just had to tell them, I guarantee you I know half the stuff on the test already. And I was fully prepared to take the full exam, and then suddenly I just got an essay that was like, describe describe the effects of the Napoleonic Wars by country and the national outlook towards it, or something like that. And the way that these tests work, you have to basically include like 5 of whatever the topic is for the historical topic, and then you have to come up with 2 on your own to make sure that you just know the subject. And I lucked out. They gave me resources for the countries that I was less clear on, and I could just add in something like Poland and Italy, for the puppet states or the resisting states in Italy, and I got a 4 without basically having done anything that whole year, which means I just got like a free European history credit. I wrote a few essays, which means that I got basically 9 college credit hours for free.
Yeah, for nothing. Yeah. And I mean, I can say the same thing. So I was not a particularly talented Latin scholar. Just language is something I have a hard time. Non-English language is something I have a hard time wrapping my brain around. for the AP test, and I think I just got really lucky. The way it worked was the one for Latin is you have to write some essays on Roman culture. Great, knock that part out of the park. And then there are 2 brick translations, one from Caesar and one from Virgil. And Caesar is great. Caesar is like baby's first Latin. It's awesome. You know exactly what's happening, who's killing who. You need like 100 words. It was written for Roman peasants or city dwellers, and you got it. Now, Virgil, on the other hand, is incomprehensible garbage. You can go ages without finding the subject and verb of a sentence. And I realize that, look, getting into classics digressions is not particularly interesting. But nonetheless, I managed to pass that exam. And this is another example of something I did not deserve to pass. I wrote the essay. I did fine on the Caesar section. And then on the Virgil section, which is the last part of the test, I was like, oh no, this is a third of the test. I got nothing on this one. Like I know some of these words, but to be perfectly honest, I didn't really do a lot of this in class. So I just kind of threw some words up there and then wrote an essay in English, which is not the prompt at all, a bunch of true but not particularly relevant things about Virgil. Got full college credit for it. And so
awesome. Yeah.
Like all of these is not to say like, oh wow, I'm so smart. That's the opposite of what I'm trying to say is that the standards.
The system is way too easy to game. Is I think the
system
point.
Is entirely too easy to game. And I mean, I very much spent my entire college career gaming the system because especially for classes that, and this is the other thing that they really kind of like they get you with certain classes. Like they want you in there for as long as possible, and they want you taking as much other garbage as possible. So you have to keep paying them essentially. Right. So I literally in my last year my last semester in school, I had to take an actual WEF course essentially on and I'm literally sitting there listen to a Morgoth video, show up in class, and there's Larry Fink talking about the Great Reset at a presentation in the front of class. I'm like, oh no, it's happening. But my point is all of these kind of BS classes that are tangentially but not really related to what you're there for. So for instance, I have a fairly in-depth granular level finance degree. And look, I get it. There are certain things I have to know. But why am I taking a class on international relations? I'm designed to work on the personal level. Hey, invest my money for me. In what context am I going to be talking about trade policy between China and Canada? But nonetheless, they want me for it. Same thing with writing. I had to take another writing course, despite the fact that I tested out of it, have previous credits in it. But you didn't do it the way we wanted to.
Yeah.
And so, it's this kind of competing system of making it easier and giving you more worthless things to do. So you essentially just stay kind of hooked up to the drip forever. And I think that's another reason you see this push to, go to grad school, get your doctorate, stay in school longer and longer and longer. And it's essentially just to put you in this position of eternal debt slavery.
Oh, well, yeah, it's to put you in that position. But then you get some that are well-meaning, and it's go to grad school for the next 5 years of your life so that we can put you at a position that you would have been at when you graduated with an associate's degree 50 years ago.
Yes, exactly. We've just weakened down, the soup so much at this point that you need 3 bowls to get the same caloric value. And it's just could we just make it really hard and skip all the other stuff? I would really like to be done by now. But, and this is something that the libertarians do have right, is that the system of federal funding and grants and student loans has created such perverse incentives to balloon the cost of tuition. So for instance, have you seen, this is particularly egregious and you can pull this up, have you seen the LSU Lazy River?
No.
Okay, so state schools and anything that really receives a lot of federal funding gets a ton of money from the government. They get a ton of money, obviously, through student loans. They get a ton of money now from international students from China. And because they're nonprofits, the way they're structured is they need to spend a certain amount of the money in their books every year. So
okay, hold on. Let me just, I just want to see, I'm going to pull this up before you tell us what this is. And I just want to see if the initial impression I'm getting is potentially wrong, because this is hilarious.
You should bring this up and show it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So your headline from the this isn't like just some random, right? You can see the big logo up here. LSU's Lazy River and the student fee sham. So already we're being told this is something has gone wrong here, and we get this giant photo of LSU. Yeah. Waterworks. Is my impression here is that they perhaps spent an inordinate amount of money,
$85 million, yes,
on this project, to keep tuition at the rate it is, to justifiably keep it at that rate, and then let me guess, the state probably propped them up as a result.
Exactly.
I haven't read this article at all. Is that what happened?
Yeah, no, exactly. And basically what's happened is that as funding has become easier and easier to come by for these schools, and they are still kind of required to spend it, that the largesse has gotten ridiculous. They spend money on things that are absurd. For instance, like a lazy river, which for those who aren't familiar is like a water park attraction, where the current pulls you along in the shape of their logo. So quite literally, they built a water park because they needed to spend the money. And it creates this perverse system where tuition rises and rises and rises because the money's free. You can get a loan for whatever. So of course they're going to jack up the commission, or the tuition, because really it's just a loan. When you're 18, what is the difference between a $20,000 loan and a $21,000 loan? But you just have that trend played out over time. And also that really the role of colleges and universities has shifted from education to entertainment. It's like an adult daycare. So essentially people go to college allegedly to learn, but really to essentially have like a 4-year pause on their life where they drink, they party, they have a ton of sex, they drink,
they destroy their mortal soul. Yeah,
exactly. And look, like there's a certain amount of like depravity and degeneracy that's just normal to humans. You're never gonna get around it. But essentially the system is there to subsidize it. It's there to keep you there for as long as possible. It's to essentially get you. And I don't mean to say that there's some smoky back room where, guys in 3-piece suits are, saying like, oh yeah, we'll send them to school to break down their eternal souls. Although I could be convinced, I guess. But nonetheless, it's having this effect where we really are, sending people off to be destroyed. And it's why I'm very sympathetic to the fact that like, if you have kids, really think carefully about sending them to college, because I'm lucky, right? I'm unusually disagreeable as a person, and especially after my experience at the first school, I was like, well, screw you guys. I'm not listening to a single thing you say. And so after that, it was pretty much like, whatever you say, I do the opposite. But the vast majority of people aren't that disagreeable, right? They go along to get along. And that's a very natural, normal human inclination. But when you're in this type of, perverse system, it's no shock that, like I said at the opening, that, kids from even, relatively, traditionalist Christian backgrounds, they go away to university and they come back as, gay communists.
Right. I remember last year. So something I do is I play the trumpet for the VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and their ceremonies and all of that.
All right.
And I remember I went to the one for Memorial Day, and everyone enjoyed what I played. You play taps, you play a couple of other pieces afterwards. You have all the ceremonial pomp in a non-negative circumstance. I'm just not going to even try to call it by the official military terms because I'm going to get it wrong. But I play for them, and I was talking to a couple of the older guys before the whole ceremony started. And they asked me what am I doing? They thought I was in late high school, and I told them, well, I'm going into my second year in college. And they said, colleges are going way downhill. Make sure they don't make you crazy. Basically is to summarize what they said. And then one guy next to me said, yeah, make sure you make them crazy though. So kind of push back against them is what they were thinking. And I have the benefit in that I basically do a bunch of work in 3 churches in this area. I have the church here in my college town, I have the church in my hometown, and then I sing, and hopefully we'll be playing for the church in Tulsa that's over there. But you know, I'm not really the easiest person for this university to just sort of imprint all the subversion onto me, especially given that I hold the university in absolute contempt, having to deal with this bureaucracy. But the vast majority of people, as you say, going back to what we were talking about earlier, you don't have those familial bonds. Basically every half of all the people come from like divorced parents or something like that, something insane. And then you have you don't really get churches. People don't get brought to church anymore. There's no congregation to make sure that people stay in line. There's not even church discipline if you do get brought to churches. I would be shocked if you showed me someone being defrocked for teaching false doctrine or living falsely, and passing that off as something common. You don't get any of these things that would keep a person from sort of sliding. And then you send them off to university away from you. They are out of your home now. Every single influence that they have is a subversive, basically, unless you get something rare. The non-exceptional circumstances, you get sent somewhere and all you have around you is constant subversion. The professors, the bureaucracy, the propaganda, the television, the iPads and the internet, all of that. There is no escape for the vast majority of these people. And then, you had 2014, 2015, the funny genre on YouTube was look at these crazy lefty college campus types. If we just laugh at them enough, they'll realize they're the stupid ones, and then everything will go back to normal. And that's not all what happened, for quite obvious reasons, hopefully. You can't just laugh at the problem or just bury your head in the sand and hope that it goes away 99% of the time. These subversives, these people that had absolute subversion imprinted on them for, basically their entire life for 4 years, it turns out if you laugh at them, the subversion doesn't just disappear for the majority of them. They just get led along by whatever is the most dominant force, which in this case happens to be the public universities, which might as well just be an arm of the state or the media.
Right. No, that's well said. And I think that obviously, especially with the recent news about Twitter, it's been a lot of fun to laugh at the shit libs, right? And that's fun. I don't get it. I'm sorry. I don't mean to denigrate it, but I think that it's important to remember that that's not the end goal. You don't laugh at them to laugh at them. Kind of like eternally staying in the cope and seed space is not productive. But it is a W, right? And to a certain extent, like, you need these psychological victories. You need something. And fair enough, it may not be the final victory. Sorry, I realized that I meant to say final solution, but that's really not what I meant.
I mean, yeah, call it the end seed or something like that.
Yeah.
As well.
But nonetheless, right, that there is something to be had in that. And I think that I get frustrated as much as the next guy at, we'll make fun of them, ... step 2, step 3, step 4, we win. It's just like in between. But I do think there is something to be said for the fact that we are kind of blessed in the fact that our enemies are deeply uncool and embarrassing. Like, say what you will about, Lenin, say what you will about Trotsky, they weren't embarrassing people. They were kind of sinister. And that doesn't mean that there aren't, sinister, competent people. But when you look at, and especially university admin, who are very clearly your enemies, these aren't intimidating people. They're kind of weak and gross and just dysgenic. And you look at them and you're like, okay, obviously you have power. If this was a direct confrontation of, like bureaucratic might, you demolish me. But you kind of look at it and you're like, okay, well, these people aren't exactly, hardened, Soviet revolutionaries.
Right. Yeah. At least with Lenin and Trotsky, despite their stature, they could at least rouse a crowd into complete and total violence and, have nothing but a grimace on their face the entire time that they did so for however many hours they spoke. With the bureaucracy that you see in these schools, I have no clue if there ever once was a time that these university bureaucracies were even slightly more efficient or relatively better. But now it is exactly as you say. The quality of human stock there is low. Obviously, if they were better, they would be doing something else. If they were more intelligent, they would be working elsewhere on the university or in another job if they aren't just a student. If they were stronger, they could probably get paid more doing something more in the trade section of occupational capacity. If they looked better, they could probably be doing something a bit more public facing than sitting behind a stained window with paperwork. So that's just the state of things.
Well,
And then
much the point brought up in Spandrel's blog post about bio-Leninism,
yes,
is that these people in any normal system would not have the amount of power that they do. And so obviously on a deep level, they know that. And that's a big reason that the foot soldiers of the regime are freaks, because essentially the more outside of the normal, I guess, like civilizational status hierarchy you are, when you're raised up, you're way more loyal because you've got stuff to lose. I mean, because you look at, like, if you can imagine kind of like a bizarro world Jaybird, right? So with my exact same set of skills, but, just a pure, mustache twirling, dastardly villain. Like, why would I, as a person, with my same relative level of competence, why would I join, the regime? I have plenty of options. Like, if all I want is to maximize money, well, I'd probably go into banking, which, fair enough, maybe it's related to the regime, but it's not the same as being a university admin.
right, or a bureaucrat, yeah.
So even like the evil version of me, I wouldn't have the same loyalty to the regime. But if you are just one of these, like a Lori Lightfoot type, to use an example,
yeah,
my favorite American politician, you look at someone like that and you're like, oh, if this regime didn't pick you, you would be a nobody. So of course, that person's going to fight like hell for the regime because that is their meal ticket. And I think you see that very clearly in the university system.
Fight just enough is, I think, the bureaucratic mindset.
Well, I would argue that when you see a lot of like the people actually out on the streets, like the Antifa types.
Oh yeah.
Are, I mean, not in the workplace. I mean,
Okay, yeah, those types are zealots.
And so, I've lost my train of thought. But well, it probably wasn't important anyway. Just Gen spiteful mutants, Jacob. Jay, that's well played.
So, but with the types in the bureaucracy, it's the typical conservative argument, and we don't like to use typical conservative arguments anymore because conservatives are cringe and they've thus said nothing of value ever. But something that is absolutely true to this day, just as a real analysis, is that bureaucrats are petty tyrants. And that's because every incentive that you have for the bureaucrat in these systems is to where, what little power they have, being as they basically accepted the job at the bottom rung, they might as well use, at least for their own personal, dopamine output, at the very least. Which means that if you just slightly annoy them, if it's someone they don't like, they can make that bureaucracy really painful or drawn out or anything to that effect. And so, that's the payment for the bureaucrat. It's not the money, and it's not like the vanity or anything else, which you could get in any other job if the human stock was better. It's the fact that you can exercise, mild annoyance. And that's how the society currently operates right now. It's no longer by strict standards with corporal punishment, written laws or unwritten laws and all this other stuff. It's by passive aggression, which is the bureaucratic way.
No, definitely. And I think the other thing that makes the university system so evil, it is really like one of the prime, I guess, patronage networks of our enemies. That if you are, in exchange for your loyalty to the regime, you are given a cushy job, a pretty much endless, pension, and, a very, very convenient working schedule. And so when you see these people, like, there's a reason that the cost of tuition has skyrocketed. And a large part of that is the largesse that we mentioned earlier, the university water parks, the things like that. But another part is the number of administrators has, exploded. And really it's because this is a patronage network. These people are eternal regime supporters. And in exchange for that, they get all of the things that I mentioned earlier. And so obviously it is convenient for the regime to use the university system essentially as like a storage space for its patrons. But obviously when you massively bloat this system and turn it into a patronage network instead of a education system, big shock, standards fall, your output suffers. You have changed the purpose of the machine, and as a consequence, your output changes.
Right. And this is hyperbolic from our wonderful chat, which I've I have been following. It's just due to the stream I can't do both talk in the chat and do the stream. But this makes the point very well. 5 assistant vice presidents or vice deans of diversity. That's basically what you're talking about. Your enemies understand implicitly. I don't hear them talking like this, but they understand implicitly that if they can just get their friends and supporters in set positions in these areas, they can basically just rule unopposed. They will never articulate it like that. I doubt they even think like that, but it's what happens. So those diversity departments are not being done necessarily because they are zealots, though I'm sure they are, and they are still definitely evil. This doesn't absolve them. But those diversity departments and initiatives are basically just getting their friends into the university to make it more amicable to them, to whoever is running these things. So, very evil still. Definitely has a lot of terrible consequences, but there is the patronage element that is definitely there. Now, with that being said, we're saving Peterson for last. Just because I think that might go on for just a little bit. I have 3 more things here to discuss. Actually, no, never mind. We have 2 more things to discuss before Peterson. Anarcho-tyranny. You mentioned that in the beginning, the opening, if you will. And you basically just said it was being used to keep virtue and good incentives from arising. So this is a basic talking point, but give us have you personally seen this?
Oh yeah, so there's a example, right? So when I lived in Richmond, I lived close to a neighborhood called Jackson Ward, which you can look up if you want. It's basically the ghetto. It's a very dangerous neighborhood, and so essentially, it's interesting having because my fiance is actually quite comical. She's like 5'10" Swedish, so very, very, very white, and she worked at a school where I think there was one other white student there, and the rest of it was, all black. And so the teachers there at this all black school, despite not being particularly good teachers, are essentially the upper crust of that community, right? They are the people who went to school, and that doesn't mean that they're, great scholars, but just by virtue of the fact that they graduated high school and went to school, even one with lower standards, right? That puts them in the upper crust of their community. And they would talk to, my fiance very much about how essentially like the people around them are stuck in this really nasty situation where they are incentivized towards bad behavior, right? So the way that the welfare system works in the US, you are incentivized not to have a man in the house. You are incentivized to have as many children as you want. And so obviously this has been going on for decades, but it's created this horrible system where parents are specifically trying not to make money so they can get on the dole. They're specifically trying not to even cohabitate so that they can stay on the dole. And so that's a great example. And these people and Richmond's a great example because there was a ton of violence in Richmond over the Summer of Love, so to speak. And essentially what happened is that in payment for the violence during the Summer of Love, there was, quote unquote, police reform in the city, which means that essentially in many of those neighborhoods, the police don't do anything. They won't stop anything to do with drugs anymore. And really a lot of violence as well. So in exchange for, essentially showing up and terrorizing the regime's enemies, making an ideological point, over the summer of 2020, not only does the Gibbs train keep going, the gravy train keep rolling, but will lighten up the touch of the law on you. So you can do whatever you want. And so you've seen this has affected everyone negatively. And this is one of the things that I kind of get on people in our circles for, that they forget that community is used as a bludgeon by other parties. They themselves are not the mastermind at the top of this. And while there's a lot of bad
very
behavior,
obviously so.
Right, and there's a lot of bad behavior from that community, but it's not like they are living great lives. These people are living incredibly debased lives.
Well, yeah, specifically that they're not living great lives, that they are able to be used as a tool.
Exactly. So that the system has really created this really perverse incentive to keep the lowest members of the society eternally immiserating themselves, getting worse and worse and worse, because it makes them a convenient stick to use to beat the middle class, right? The kulak class, the people who conceptually could be next generation's elites.
Right. So You mentioned a very interesting topic there, and that would be drug use. The police don't stop drug use, and there's a lot of opinions on the war on drugs, drug bans, and all this other stuff. But I remember when I was in school, drug use was a major problem, even going into the middle schools, which would be ages like 12 to 14, give or take. So 12, 13, 14, maybe one less or one more, depending on how old the classes are. There would be major drug uses in like the bathrooms and hallways or whatever else. So, that's bad. You don't want 12 to 14-year-olds on anything really. Like you would typically want to keep them on as little medicine as possible so that they can develop normally. Use it sparingly. But you had marijuana. Some people had cocaine. Other people would have stuff that would be much harder. You had alcohol trades as well, which probably slightly less bad than the drugs. But I made a post on my Telegram the other day, and I called marijuana America's opium, which sounds very counterintuitive because we have something that the media has been hammering on called the opioid crisis and all this other stuff. But I had a very different intention, which is that the Qing dynasty did not ban opium because it was had like bad health effects or something like that. It was specifically because it was dissolving Qing society, the opium, by making people lazy, by making them not want to do anything. They would spend their extra time not building, not being with their family. They would go to opium dens and just sit there high. And that's basically what happens with marijuana in the United States. The opioids are a different thing. They're being overused medically. But you don't see your next generations of productive people sat on opioids. It's marijuana. So did you see anything like this when you were in school? Because you might have been removed, because this stuff is a bit new, but I don't know. A lot can change in 4 years between you and me.
It was less so in high school, but it's definitely in college. And I can imagine conceptually a world in which, I guess, we develop kind of a marijuana culture similar to alcohol culture, in which there's like a productive context to use it in. I'm not completely convinced, but I'm willing to entertain it as a possibility. But what it really functions as now is kind of another way and it's predominantly, at least in my experience, obviously like a lot of black men smoke, but predominantly it's a lot of like white and Asian guys who really should be doing better with themselves, but essentially have kind of allowed themselves to fall into like the sports ball, Call of Duty, porn, and weed cycle, like eternal escapism. And to me, it's like that escapism is never good, and especially not in this kind of like chemical sense. And I know guys in college who were smart guys, but just like smoked their brains out. And by the end of it, they were kind of gone. They were just like, their memories were gone. They were slow on the uptake. They like had all the weird focus issues. And so like, look, like I'm no Puritan. I enjoy a drink from time to time. I think I've enjoyed cigarettes from time to time as well. And I've, had an edible or two, but to me, it's just like you look at enough people for whom that just destroys them. And it doesn't necessarily destroy them in the same way that a hard drug addiction does. But I mean, do you know anyone who regularly smokes weed who's made more interesting or sharper or more present by that?
No, but I know plenty of people that have become much lazier and have completely squandered their talent.
Yeah, exactly. And so look, like obviously I have, being in kind of a more rural area, I know people who have had really nasty, heroin, opioid addictions. And if I had to choose, yeah, I'd rather smoke weed than do heroin. Okay, but neither of those are good things, and the idea that like everyone has their vice to a certain degree is true, but also like just because you have a predilection to something does not necessarily mean you should indulge in it. Like, look, I have my own, like degenerate predilections. We all do. We're all children of the ashes, but that doesn't make it good. And I think also that one of the things that's really affected my state is that my state, recently legalized, and at the same time has also legalized consumer grade gambling. And what you've seen is that these lower class areas, both, black and white, have been overrun with, smoke shops, casinos, gambling dens on every single corner.
Dispensaries and
and look, like I am this is somewhat ironic from someone who I guess technically comes from the Puritan tradition. But the idea that you can essentially stamp out vice and make kind of a, a holy city on earth is one that I am, very much against. There's always going to be vice. You can't stamp it out. You can limit it. You can put social stigma against it. So I'm not saying that we need, a police of vice and virtue to go around and, if you bet 25 cents on an Uno game, well, it's off to the prison ships with you. That's not my point. My point is that like these things create normative and cultural shifts, and the difference between gambling being something that is underground or kind of looked at as disreputable to something you can literally do on every single street corner. Same thing with weed. Like, that's not a positive change, and I'm not necessarily trying to go into like reefer madness territory, but it does just create like these legions of like fat, docile, doughy bugmen.
Right, and that's why I compared it to opium. Quite unfortunately, I might make a video, called something like "The Opioid Crisis is a Diversion," but something that I do not like the libertarians for is that they have, with the help of various other forces, almost single-handedly made weed a normal thing, at least among my generation, which you can get into medical aspects and all this other stuff, but like, I remember one time I was trying to organize a brass ensemble to play Baroque music, and literally all of my options were, busy smoking weed, the days that I wanted to do anything, so it couldn't take off. Like, that's one example, and there are many others. I knew people in my classes that were very bright when we were like freshmen, and then by the time we got to senior year, they were just husks, because they were doing all of this. So that's the downside here. You're losing a lot of utilization of talent.
No, definitely. And I mean, I think that I can't imagine how someone looks at modern society and says, "Oh, if we just had a little more escapism, if escapism was easier, life would be better." And Thomas brought up a point that I think is quite right, where it's like, look, like the idea of criminalizing possession is a kind of a new and nefarious one in Western law.
Right.
I get that. I think that the way we went about the war on drugs was a wrong one, and that the way that it, we kind of just because the war on drugs is a bad idea does not mean, the converse position of therefore drugs good is the correct way to go. And I think that that's the problem that, kind of like the libs have fallen into. And you see this with the discussion about, how homelessness, Walker, with the discussion around, homelessness and open air drug use in places like San Francisco. Like when you look at that, and okay, fair enough, we're not throwing people in jail for simple possession. But when you have people in every American city essentially, killing themselves through drug use, horribly schizophrenic, assaulting people on the sidewalk, defecating in public. I don't know, maybe that's not the right solution. I'm again going to go out on a limb here.
Right. And so this touches on a much deeper topic of addiction, because any addiction, regardless of whether it's psychological or just a category, is going to ruin someone. And it doesn't matter necessarily what the object of the addiction is. And this goes back to sort of the anarcho-tyranny preventing virtue thing. Is these were laws on the book, and they were for a long time. Some states still have the laws on the book to prosecute people that they don't like if they get caught or planted with some sort of drug that's illegal but easy to come across. This is entirely meant to make sure that virtue does not arise. They will make sure the general population can get addicted to whatever the population chooses, which makes them entirely reliant on that thing, which is also a security concern. And then any of the regime's counter factions will just be completely dissolved because they won't have the manpower. You can't draw on all those people that are now addicted, and you also will get planted or caught with something. It's the E. Michael Jones point about lust, but that's the there's an inherently anti-virtuous element about addiction, regardless of whether it's tobacco, marijuana, sex, gambling, all this other stuff. And that doesn't make me a Puritan. That was just readily accepted by basically every moral system until maybe 70 years ago.
Well, I agree, and I think there's also something to be said for the fact that there's kind of a chicken and the egg problem where,
Hmm.
to a certain degree, people seek out escapism. They seek out these addictive, I guess, like patterns, largely because they have no meaning in life, right? Obviously, there have always been alcoholics. There have always been, nymphomaniacs. There's always been, people addicted in any time. That's just a baseline level. But there is something to be said for the fact that, like, in this kind of like pointless society where so many people essentially exist just to be human matter, like to a certain degree, I feel sympathy for people who want to get away from it, because
Yeah.
that is a very nasty, pointless way to live. And so I think it's all too easy to kind of, beat up on the normie, the type of person who doesn't really think. But to be honest, they're kind of the biggest victims of this because in an earlier era, they didn't really have to.
Well,
They
they're
kind of,
explicitly the biggest victims of this because the whole strategy requires making the average person a victim by preying on their way of life.
right, exactly. And so like look, like as much as I kind of make dismissive comments about the bugmen, and there certainly are like actively evil, like bug people. But a lot of these guys I feel a lot of sympathy for because you ever look at someone, this, and there's memes about this where it's like, you know, 80 years ago, you'd be doing fine. Like, or the meme is like, it's this big guy sitting in a call center. And like 200 years ago, you'd be, or like, sorry, it was 800 years ago, you'd be leading a war band. And
Yeah,
obviously like, that's kind of a joke. There's something kind of stupid about that, but there's
it's
something
it's
true to
the
fact
idea gets communicated.
yeah, that very many people are just maladapted for modernity. And as you adapt to modernity, you really become less and less human. You become more of this kind of like, you know, asexual, smooth freak. I mean, and you see this very much in the like non-binary Zoomers. They start to kind of converge to this like, asexual blob person. Kind of like just this like formless mass where it's like, were you originally a man or a woman? I can't tell, but you're kind of revolting from either angle. Obviously, those people made choices. They actively made choices, but
Yes.
really, they're kind of many of those people would, in given different circumstances, be functional members of society. I was talking to my fiance about this, where she has a someone she knows, not like a direct friend.
Hmm.
And this guy was a high-ranking Virginia politician, and his daughter went trans and got a ton of, quote unquote support, went through with the top operation, was featured in political ads. And really it's because, this guy and his daughter and, their family are associated with like upper crust society. And now if you're high status upper crust society, you're team blue. So
Right.
following, the team blue morality, his daughter transed herself, he featured her in his ads. But I mean, realistically, even if he is a purely cynical actor, like just a absolutely scummy politician, but he is operating by 1910s morality, even if his daughter is one of those rare cases that would have wanted to be, a cross-dresser anyway, would he have featured her in political ads? Would he have, paid for the operations himself? Of course not, because that would have been, a social stigma. And so now because of, like the changing social attitudes, his daughter's life is ruined. And again, like to me, I do feel a great deal of sympathy for these people.
Yes, and that gets to the sort of nature of people do make choices on their own volition, but you can also only make choices with what you have in front of you. I can't make the choice to fly right now because I don't have wings. But I can make the choice to walk somewhere, to sit here, or whatever else. So there is blame that does lie in the average person, but there's also much greater blame. Not that one should be taken at the expense of the other. That lies with the people putting the choices in front of the average person, and that lies with the person encouraging the average person to go along with it. So that's a distinction that I usually try to make, which absolves none of them and implicates all of them, but hopefully to their just guilt. Now, one last thing. Oh,
Oh yeah,
what
sure.
was that?
I was just going to say, but I think that there's a further, I guess, like level to draw on, which is that there's kind of this, again, further like self-fulfilling cycle where the kind of awkwardness and maladjustment of, being a kid who has only, interacted with people, through a screen, again, especially through COVID, you're going to feel uncomfortable in your skin. You're going to feel maladjusted. And when the solution for all your ills is to, chemically castrate yourself and get, lifelong, altering, operations, like
Mutilations.
it's no surprise. And we're really seeing, and I can kind of wrap this up in a bow, that the liberal idea of, my will overall, like I decide, we're kind of seeing come to its natural conclusion, which is I decide my sex, I decide my gender, I decide how everyone must refer to me, even when I'm not there, by my pronouns. And so that force of social disintegration, which we've, kind of followed through this, long and rambling conversation, we're seeing it, brought very much to its natural conclusions. And so if we were going to get out of this, we're going to have to sacrifice our personal capacity to choose.
Right. And yeah, with that, what's going to happen now is we are going to run through super chats. We're going to let our good guest, Mr. Burden, here shill once again, and then we are going to discuss Peterson. So, this is not the stream wrapping up. I'm trying to make sure that we can, if people donate, I'm putting the super chats in a part of the stream where people don't just bleed off anymore. So, that's going to be the fun conversation. Definitely do not leave and miss that, because I'm sure there's going to be controversial opinions that come out. So, we have Mr. Cringewalker for $5. Suspended Reason is a blogger I recently found who describes these conservative ghost dances as, optocratic cargo cults doomed to a parasitic overload. Okay, so there's a blogger describes the ghost dances. They're entirely for vision, entirely for performance. Cults, parasitic. Okay, so let me see if I get this concept right. They're describing the conservative ghost dances as something that's just on for show, but still very much cult-like, and it's going to attract people that are just going to be parasitic off of them. It is a very profitable thing to do conservative ghost dancing, and eventually the whole thing's going to collapse. Is that the right reading?
That's close to what I've pulled up Suspended Reason. I've never heard that blog before. I mean,
I haven't either.
I don't know if I can, immediately find it, because it seems to be a real theory cell blog. But so I will look into that, because it sounds interesting to me. But off the top of my head, I can't add anything to your reading.
Okay.
Yes,
that's what I get from this message. If it's wrong, then by all means go check out Suspended Reason. I presume that it will be better articulated there.
It's Cringewalker in chat. Optocratic. Yes. Optocratic versus autocratic. I don't know what autocratic means.
I thought optocratic would mean like rule by vision or something like that, optics. But
again, that's my best bet, but I'm going to type that in and see.
While you search that, we have another one.
This is a distinctly different one.
Okay.
Optocratic. Basically, you're trying to optimize value.
Okay.
Which I guess that makes sense. That I can see how that matters. If that's the term that it's, if that's its correct context. Oh, he made up the word. Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I think we're going to have to find his exact definition on it. But maybe it means, to optimize, and maybe it means to see. We'll have to figure out, I guess.
Do that on your own time, because I was just guessing with sort of like the optics. But Cringewalker for another $5. Sometimes I'm glad I just wrote my name on orientation sessions in college and left. I have no idea what they taught. I wasn't even there. Given what Jay Burden has told us, that sounds like by far the most the wisest decision. I don't think I could sit through that stuff without yelling and being generally quite mad.
Yeah, again, like I said, I was a different person then.
So, yes, thank you, Cringewalker, for both your super chats. I don't think I missed anything else. We'll just do one last run through. I think that those were the only super chats. Yes. Alrighty. So one last shill, and then we will discuss Jordan Peterson and probably the more controversial topic this stream.
All right.
So, where can people find you?
You can find me, The Jay Burden Show, on YouTube, Spotify, Apple. It's 2 to 3 times a week, hour-long interview show. I recently had Ryan Turnip on. just last night. We talked about the Zoomers. I've also spoken to, Semiagog, Thomas777, Pete Quinones, anyone like that. Upcoming, I have some big guests. AA and I are in discussions to have a talk, rather, not to be redundant, on education for the next couple weeks. So the content train is going to continue at full speed ahead. And if you would like to support the show, I have links on my YouTube channel to my Subscribe Star, as well as a buy me a coffee if you just want to send a one-time donation. I'd really appreciate that. I have a scheme set up where the episodes are always and forever free on my YouTube channel. But if you want to listen to the audio versions, the first 10 episodes, the most recent 10 episodes, are free. And then past that point, they drop behind a paywall on my Substack. And it's just $5 a month to have access to my full audio backlog so you can listen to them and not have to have YouTube running. But yeah,
Fantastic.
That's pretty much all my links.
And if your other, I haven't watched every single interview that you have done. I've watched a few of them though. If they're like the ones that I've seen, I can definitely recommend go check out Jay Burton. Very, very cozy and excellent discussions. And, just something that I have been slightly lazy about doing. We will take this time before talking about the last subject to thank anyone that is subscribed on Subscribestar, past or present. Now remember, the Subscribestar, the link is in the description. I can only do this because it does generate some form of revenue. Subscribestar takes much less of a cut, and more importantly, it does not go to Alphabet. So everyone that is subscribed on Subscribestar, past and present, thank you. Prince of Parma, Claude Boyd, Yeehaw Yenzer, Jerome Urbic. We have a user that is an auto-generated name, Conan Wells, Brian Bugno, Enigma, and Falling Outside the Normal Moral Constraints. These are all of the less public subscribers. They don't get the fancy super chats or all that stuff, but it is more beneficial for them because the purpose of donating the money goes much farther. More of it reaches the intended target. And it's more beneficial for me, obviously, for that same reason. And there's also the moral point. It does not go to Google. And then we also have one last super chat here. Drew Parrott for $4.99. New to Jay Burton. Absolute weapon. Keep up the great work, Turnip. Well, thank you, Drew. We do try our best. That is something that we can guarantee. We very rarely do anything half-heartedly in public. So, if you have anything else to comment there.
No, I do, but thank you for the kind word. Absolute weapon. I'll add that to my list of compliments. I got absolutely demolished on Twitter a while back because someone referred to me as a podcast American. I don't know if I've ever recovered from that, but I guess the absolute weapon might kind of tip me back into the black, so to speak.
Yeah, you can put that in your bio.
Yeah.
And we have a $9.99 donation from Speedrunner, who's been very faithfully discussing in the comments. I absolutely love it when we spark conversation in the comments. Everything's really alive. Just tossing into the tip jar. Thank you very much, sir. It is donations like this that allows me to justify doing this. Now, if we get any more super chats, we will discuss them at the end. So, Jordan Peterson, you mentioned him at the beginning. And if I remember correctly, it was in the context of he or at least did do good work and making sure that Zoomers could find some sort of purpose or structure that had been taken from them. Is that an unfair characterization?
I mean, I don't even know if I would put it that far. I think that, and Oron does a good job of bringing this up, that people are kind of at different stages of, being like base, being right wing. And for a lot of people, they couldn't really handle, the spinning wheels, the Evola posting, all of this. Like your defenses are up. You see that stuff and you just immediately reject it because you have so much kind of programming. But for Zoomers who I view as kind of critically deracinated, critically atomized, even the idea that, in order to find meaning in life, I have to sacrifice something. In order to have meaning in life, I must take up responsibility. Okay, that's dad advice. But if you never got it, you need that to go further. And so for me, at least, I stand by what I said earlier. His new work and a lot of his work, especially post benzo addiction, is hot garbage. It's trash. Right. But all the same, I mean, I think that if we look at it, people like me, people like Prudentialist, there are a lot of people on this side of things who are right wingers who would not be here without him. And so I think that There's this urge to kind of oh, everything to the left of me is cringe. Anything before the like current cool esoteric right wing like hot button issue is cringe. And it's this like eternal mindset of cringe and based that is just like it's kind of unproductive. And again, like I said, the most recent stuff he's done is indefensibly bad. But the idea that you can just throw out the true, I guess, like value he provided for us in our circles, I think is a little bit immature.
Right, yes. And I'm going to avoid doing that because my position on Peterson has never been he has done no good. I usually will take the position, you can go back to me saying such things on AA's and on Academic Agents channel like a year and a half ago, or maybe even before then, closer to when I was first debuted. I would say he's a net negative. And this was a very controversial thing. A lot of people thought that I was just throwing him out because I had become based in trad and Jordan Peterson was a filthy modernist. That was not the issue. The thing that I usually do not like Peterson for is his specific stated intentions. If you remember what he says, he always positions himself as a de-radicalizing agent, and specifically for those on the right. Because he will do a lot of work talking about the terrible effects of left-wing radicals. But then he will say, but the right-wing radicals do much more in much shorter amounts of time. They're worse. He points out the left because it was less publicized, not because it was worse necessarily in his view. Now, he's trying to de-radicalize people by making things slightly more bearable, given. So that is in its own way somewhat good potentially. But we brought up Jordan Peterson while talking about you can't just like magic things into thin air. You have to trade off something in order to do something else. You can't just get pure benefit.
Yes. Yeah.
I would posit the line of reasoning that a lot of the terrible situations that we find ourselves in the terrible state of society right now will naturally resolve itself, probably through some sort of bloodshed and great horror. But at the very least, everything will come back as it normally will. And you can put this down to judgment from God. Typically, God will cull a great population, especially in the Old Testament or after the crucifixion of Christ, for instance. You will get this great judgment that will set everything back on its path. Things will be really bad for a couple of generations. But then at the very least, you get a few generations afterwards where people are faithful again. You can see this in the cycle of civilizational and cultural development. Civilizations will either mummify or collapse. But at least then afterwards, there's something else. It is a foreign culture, granted. But that's just how these things work. They have life cycles. We can't expect everything to last forever. Peterson and people like him, by trying to make things just slightly more bearable, is actually making things worse by prolonging this collapse or these natural consequences, and trying to prolong them is making them much worse. He's making them much greater in degree. That would be my position.
So I'll put it this way. I think that I don't really disagree with any of your analysis. I think that if he is a de-radicalization tool, he's a really bad one.
Perhaps.
Like really.
Well,
like
okay. We see the people on our side that made it over here because of Peterson. But there is leagues more that kind of went like the Crowder Shapiroite route and haven't really moved since.
Oh yeah, well definitely. But I mean that's every hierarchy is a pyramid. And so to the point that it's like, well, obviously if the hierarchy is how based in right wing you are, there's going to be kind of a natural, like as you get further and further out, there'll be fewer and fewer people.
Right.
But I would also say that I don't really, to me at least, like I've never, at least in like my political work, never been convinced of the idea that we need to get 50 plus 1. I also think that there's something to be said for the fact that like for the type of people for whom, essentially like Jordan Peterson ism is the most they can really handle. You know what I mean? Like they're the people for whom just like their capacity is being productive members of society. And that's great. And the fact that they are doing that instead of being, the kind of like, weed smoking, balding, bug men, like to me, I look at that as a win because
it
their
is
life is better. And look, like again, I'm not a huge Jordan Peterson fan. I haven't listened to a single thing he said short of the Merit video in a long time. But I do think that like that is if nothing else, like I know, people in my life who aren't the most political, and I realize this is the definition of an anecdote, but this guy was kind of fat and he wasn't really doing anything with his life. And it's not to say that he's stupid. He's just not interested in kind of like theoretical topics. He's just a normal guy.
Right.
And so now I look at people like him, and he went back to school. He's got a good degree. He's in good shape. He's like a productive person. And to me, this comes back to the idea or the argument that I have with like accelerationists, which is I guess I don't know if I can justify immunizing the eschaton and making things worse. And
right. I'm not trying to make an argument for acceleration here. What I am saying, though, is if you look at this like an ecosystem, you can't just shove a giant intervention in the way that we have for the last 60 years into the way things are running and basically just keep doing that and hope that like some sort of correction or collapse doesn't come. So he is doing good by making sure that people are better. It's just I don't know overall if this is necessarily a good in the end, because you're really just prolonging this thing that is going to happen anyways, short of our success.
I see your point. To me, and this might not be the most productive conversation. Again, my point on JBP is not that he's like the end all be all. It's just that he's done more harm than good to people in our circles. And I think that like it. I think that and maybe this is just me speaking exclusively from my own, perspective, but I think that by virtue of, when any idea becomes quote unquote popular, when it hits the mainstream, like we're seeing this very much happen, or it has happened with Moldbug over the past, year or so, that as the masses latch onto an idea, they latch onto it at a lower and lower resolution. They get like a stupider version of it. And so now you have, normicons trying to explain to me what the cathedral means, and they get it all wrong. But nonetheless, you've smuggled in an idea that's helpful in someone's real life. And to me, it's like, okay, obviously the idea that you have, the basic Peterson responsibility stuff, like that's a very low resolution version of the truth. But I think that is important for a lot of people, and that to me, I can never look at that as a bad thing. I totally get your point. Like I really do. But I also think that I guess I can't imagine anyone who would ever be useful to us eventually could stick through something like the Merit video and come out the other end and be like, yep, I'm going to stay here forever. I'm never going to move to the right, especially as, material and social conditions worsen. And I think that as we've seen the IDW fall from prominence, a large portion of the fact is that they basically got BTFO'd by COVID, by the BLM stuff. And look, my point is not to return to the marketplace of ideologies, but I do think that people are kind of naturally, they will fall in popularity as their ideas are discredited, even if people don't.
People still think and evaluate things. And, if we are right, which I think we are, we should be able to convince people. And I'm not trying to like pull the ladder up behind me and say no more watching Jordan Peterson. It's just like another thing that might sour him to me is that I know people in churches that were doing perfectly fine beforehand, and now they basically slip in this sort of Petersonian Gnosticism of like, oh, but what about all the symbology of the scriptures? And they will start focusing on that instead of the actual written scripture. So that's not the topic of conversation here, and I'm not trying to make it that way. It's just that, like, there are other spheres where I do think that he does much more harm than good, and it's not necessarily just the zoomed out outlook. There are spheres where people do just stay with him. And one last thing, someone saying I'm a post-accelerationist. I am not at all an accelerationist. I just recognize much like in an ecosystem, if you keep intervening, or if you keep something artificially done, if you keep the predator population down, if you remove like a supply of food, things will radically change. There will be a massive correction. Things will go wrong. Our human society is no different. If you just remove a ton of good things and just slightly assuage it in some area, that correction is going to be a little bit later now, but it might also be bigger, is just my concern.
That's a fair point. I think that I respect your position. I see where you're coming from.
So, but by all means, I will let you finish this conversation so as not to look like I am. I
Oh
don't
no,
want to go to Telegram later and have like 40 channels saying like, "Oh, everyone hates Peterson, but he's the only reason 40% of us are here."
so I will say, I Telegram is a blessing and a curse. It's both the funniest app ever. Like the fact that you can swap with almost no barrier between cute cat videos, mid-century German propaganda,
Yeah,
and then like friend posting is just continually fun to me. But I do think that like anything else, like it does. There are just spurgs there, and I kick them out whenever I find them. But nonetheless, like I just can't be bothered with so much of the like intra right wing drama. I just do not care. And so I'll put it this way: I feel like I don't have anything else to say. My point is not necessarily like a particularly strong one. It's just kind of my gut feelings on Peterson. And I see your point. I guess I haven't encountered him at my church, and maybe I'm not looking for it, but I can definitely see how that would be a problem because you do see that kind of like Gnosticism in him. Like his theology is bad, but
yeah,
by virtue of the fact that you're getting people talking about theology, kind of like there are many people I know who, and maybe again, this is just pure anecdote, who essentially like had never considered that there was something to be discussed. It was just, oh, it's the Bible, and by virtue of the fact that it's a discussion, I guess it's better than nothing. Maybe that's not an argument I completely agree with, but I guess that's my gut feeling. But I feel you did a perfectly fine job of addressing that. I don't feel like you stepped on my toes there.
yeah. I'm not trying to I'm not trying to say, oh, your entire intellectual journey was false and terrible. I'm just he does serve a very good purpose for getting people over to our side. And I will preface it by this: if we win, none of my concerns are legitimate. We fix things. If we don't win quick enough, then my concerns come into play, at least in my view, is what I would preface this by. Now,
See, the good news is, Turnip, we win in the end. It's just how long the time frame is.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, you and I will win, as will a lot of other people on this side. That is a fact. Now, right before the end, we had another subscriber come in on Subscribe Star, Nevermore Night. Thank you very much. Once again, very much appreciated. And something I guess I should also say is, the Subscribe Star donation amounts I think range from $3 to $7. So I'm not trying to extort people. You can cancel at any time. And by all means, if I need to set it up better, if that's what's prohibiting people from going over there, then I will gladly dedicate an afternoon to setting that up much better. And we have a final super chat from Cringe Walker for $5. Sometimes I open Telegram on public transit, knowing full well innocent bystanders are nearby and can see my screen. I hope they really enjoyed that banner of the Buddhist symbol with a nice red background and the mid-century German knight right in front of it.
I mean, Ryan, you've seen what goes on in my Telegram. So and it's not my fault, but you people are absolutely, it's like herding cats. And I'm in the same position as Cringe Walker, where every once in a while I sit in public knowing full well that whatever pops up on my screen, it will be heinous. And,
yeah.
It anyway.
I'm absolutely terrified to go to class or something like that and open Telegram. I have to turn the brightness down, hold it close to me, see who's sending the message. That's another key red flag if you're in public.
Yeah, so this is the one last one, and then we could wrap things up. By the end of my university career, I was so fully committed to my role as an enemy of the regime that I had on my laptop, I had an original Nixon campaign sticker. Another sticker that said Mount St. Helens was an inside job, and then a giant pro-life sticker, and I would get the strangest looks. And so I would sit in the front of class just, doing all of the, scrolling through all of the Telegram channels that you shouldn't. And then I was like, what are you going to do? Kick me out? Fine. I was just so jaded by the end. But yeah, Cringe Walker, I do very much relate to that.
Yeah, very good. So I think that's a very happy note to end on. Once again, Jay Burden, where can people find you?
So like I said, the Jay Burden Show, YouTube, podcatchers, you can see my interview show. Ryan and I had a great conversation, kind of a prequel to this one. But if there are people in our circles you want to hear, I've probably already had them on, or will have them on in the future. And so yeah, I'd really appreciate if you guys check that out.
Yes, by all means, go check them out. Very delightful. Thank you once again for joining us, Mr. Burden.
Yeah, sure thing, man.
And with that, hopefully everyone has a good rest of their day. Goodbye, everyone.